There's this moment in South Park, and I think about it way more than I probably should, where Cartman is standing in front of a crowd at a chili cook-off, and he's just calmly, methodically explaining to a teenager how he murdered the kid's parent, chopped them up, and cooked them into the chili that this kid just ate. And the camera holds on Cartman's face, and he's not angry. He's not frantic. He's smiling. He's genuinely, deeply satisfied. He licks the tears off this kid's face and calls them the tears of unfathomable sadness. And look, that's season 5, episode 4, Scott Tenorman Must Die, which aired July 11, 2001. And if you've seen it, you already know that nothing on television before or since has ever quite captured that specific flavor of horror. Because it's not horror in the way a slasher movie is horror. It's horror in the way that recognizing something real about human nature is horror. That a child, a 9-year-old, construction paper child, could think like that, plan like that, and feel nothing but victory when it's done. That's the moment South Park stopped being a show about kids who say bad words and became something else entirely. And tonight, we're going to talk about what that something else is. Because here's the thing about South Park that I don't think gets talked about enough. This show has been building some of the most psychologically complex characters in television history, and it's doing it with flat, paper cutout animation and fart jokes. We're talking about characters who have been on screen since August 13th, 1997, when the very first episode aired on Comedy Central. That's over 28 seasons, over 330 episodes. And across all of that time, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been quietly, sometimes accidentally, sometimes very deliberately, constructing characters whose psychological profiles are genuinely fascinating when you sit with them long enough. So tonight, we're going through all of it, every major character, every psychological thread. I'm going to break down what makes Eric Cartman one of the most terrifyingly accurate portrayals of antisocial personality traits ever put on television. I'm going to talk about why Stan Marsh's depression arc is one of the most honest depictions of losing yourself that any show has ever attempted. We're going to go deep on Kyle's moral complexity, on Kenny's impossible relationship with death and poverty, on Butters and what happens when relentless optimism meets relentless abuse. We're going to talk about Randy Marsh and what his devolution tells us about masculinity in crisis, about Mr. Garrison, and the most chaotic identity journey in the history of fiction, about characters like Tweek and Craig and Jimmy and Wendy, and all the people who live in this little Colorado town whose psychology says something real about the people watching them. If you're watching this late at night, get comfortable, because we're going to be here for a while. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is one of those videos where it really does help us keep going. Every subscriber makes a difference for a channel like this. Now let's get into it. Let's start where the show starts. Let's start with the boys. The thing about Stan Marsh is that he's the character most people think is boring, and that's exactly the point. Stan is the lens. He's the one who is closest to what a normal person would feel if they actually lived in South Park, Colorado, and had to deal with all of the insanity happening around them. Trey Parker has said that Stan is the character most loosely based on himself, and you can feel it. Stan is the one who reacts to things the way you would react to them. When something horrible happens, Stan is usually the one going, "Dude, this is pretty messed up." When Cartman does something genuinely evil, Stan is usually the one staring in disbelief. He is, by design, the audience surrogate. But here's what makes Stan psychologically interesting, and I've been thinking about this a lot while putting this video together. Stan is not just the normal one. Stan is the one who feels everything the most, and who has the hardest time processing those feelings. And the show knows this. The show has explored this repeatedly, and with increasing sophistication. And it's one of the things I think makes South Park quietly one of the best shows at depicting what depression actually looks like. Let's go back to season 7. Raisin, episode 14. Which aired December 10th, 2003. Wendy breaks up with Stan, and I know that sounds like a simple kids show plot. Boy loses girl, boy gets sad, boy gets over it. But that's not what happened. What happens is Stan completely falls apart. He stops going to school. He stops playing football with the boys. He sits in his room in the dark. And then, and this is the part that kills me, he joins the goth kid. He starts calling himself Raven. He starts wearing all black and sitting in Benny's diner drinking coffee and talking about how pointless everything is. And Kyle comes to get him, and Stan says, in this cracked, exhausted voice, "What's the point of caring if all it brings is pain?" Now look, The show plays this for comedy. The goth kids are ridiculous. Stan's poetry is terrible. But underneath the jokes, what you're watching is a kid who has no coping mechanisms for emotional pain. His first experience with heartbreak sends him into complete shutdown. And what's remarkable about the episode is that it doesn't fix that with a speech from Kyle or a lesson from his parent. It fixes it with Butters. And I want to come back to that Butters moment later, because it's one of the most important scenes in the entire series. But for now, the point is this. Stan's response to pain is withdrawal. Total, complete withdrawal. He doesn't lash out like Cartman. He doesn't try to fix things like Kyle. He just stops. He goes dark. And that would be interesting enough on its own. But then the show does something I genuinely wasn't expecting when I first watched it. 8 years later, in season 15, Episode 7, You're Getting Old, which aired June 8th, 2011, the show comes back to Stan's psychology and takes it somewhere devastating. Stan turns 10 years old, and suddenly everything literally looks and sounds like crap to him. Music sounds like fart noises. Movies look like garbage. His friends look wrong. Food tastes wrong. Everything is wrong. And the doctors diagnose him as a cynical asshole. I need you to think about what the show is actually doing here. It's taking the comedic metaphor literally. Everything looks like crap. But what it's really depicting is clinical depression, the anhedonia, the inability to enjoy things you used to love, the way the world just flattens out, and it gets worse. Stan's parents, Randy and Sharon, sit down and have a conversation that is, and I'm not exaggerating, one of the most painfully real pieces of dialogue the show has ever produced. Sharon tells Randy she isn't happy. Randy admits he isn't happy either. They agree that they seem shitty to each other. And the episode ends with a montage set to Fleetwood Mac's Landslide, and Stan's parents separate, and Kyle starts hanging out with Cartman. And Stan is alone, just completely alone. No resolution, no joke at the end, just silent and sadness. The AV Club called it both a parody of a self-serious drama's season finale and an actual self-serious dramatic season finale. Time Magazine's James Poniwozik said it moved him to tears and ranked it as one of the top 10 TV episodes of 2011. And here's the thing that really mattered. There was genuine speculation at the time that Trey Parker and Matt Stone were using the episode to talk about their own exhaustion with the show. They'd been making South Park for 14 years at that point. They were also producing The Book of Mormon on Broadway. And in a Hollywood Reporter profile from March 2011, they'd openly said they dreaded going back to make more episodes. So, You're Getting Old hit different because it felt like it might be real. Like maybe the show really was broken and wasn't coming back. It did come back. Asperger's, Season 15, Episode 8, premiered October 5th, 2011. And the show addresses Stan's depression head on. He's still depressed. Everything still looks and sounds terrible. Mr. Mackey tells him to snap out of it, which, if you've ever been depressed and had someone tell you to just cheer up, you know exactly how useless that is. Stan breaks down crying and says he doesn't know how to go on living when nothing makes him happy anymore. And I've rewatched that scene probably 6 times putting this video together, and it hits different every single time. Because it's a 9-year-old construction paper kid, and it's one of the most honest depictions of that specific kind of hopelessness I've seen in any medium. The show introduces a Matrix-style parody where a group of people who also see the world as shit recruit Stan and tell him the only way to function is to drink. And Stan discovers that alcohol actually does make things look normal again. So the episode ends with Stan back with his friend, back at home, his parents reconciled, but in the final shot, he takes a swig of whiskey under his desk, and nobody notices, and Landslide plays again. Think about that for a second. The show is telling you, in plain terms, that Stan Marsh is now an alcoholic, that the only way he can participate in his own life is through substance abuse, and this isn't a throwaway gag. This is the show acknowledging that alcoholism runs in Stan's family. Randy drinks heavily throughout the series, and Jimbo is shown drinking frequently, and that Stan is now following that same path. And it does this with construction paper characters who are technically supposed to be 10 years old. Trey Parker and Matt Stone later said they considered keeping the Marsh family separated permanently, but decided against it because they didn't want to lose Randy as a central character. Matt Stone said he disliked the idea of simply resetting things, but felt the ending, where Stan accepts change only to have everything snap back to normal, was an acceptable way of trumping traditional sitcom convention while simultaneously embracing them. And here's my theory, and I've never heard anyone else bring this up. Stan's psychology across the whole series, from Raisins to You're Getting Old, to the post-COVID specials, where adult Stan is a whiskey connoisseur, maps perfectly onto what psychologists call the trajectory of emotional avoidance. He's not equipped to sit with negative feeling. He either withdraws completely or numbs himself. And the show, whether intentionally or not, has built a character study of what happens when the normal kid in the group is actually the one suffering the most quietly. Okay, now I need to talk about the character who is not suffering quietly, who has never suffered quietly, who is, by any reasonable psychological assessment, one of the most frightening fictional characters ever created. Let's talk about Eric Cartman. I'm going to be honest with you, I've been dreading this section. Not because I don't have things to say, but because there's so much to say about Cartman's psychology that I could make an entire separate video just about him, and I might. But for now, here's what I want to focus on. Cartman is not just the fat, funny kid. Cartman is a meticulously constructed portrait of what happens when narcissistic personality trait, antisocial behavior, and unchecked emotional manipulation develop in a child who has absolutely zero corrective influences in his life. Let me set the scene. Eric Theodore Cartman lives with his mother, Leanne Cartman, who is a single parent. And I'm using the word parent loosely because Leanne Cartman is one of the worst parents in the history of fiction, and the show knows it. She gives Cartman everything he wants. She never says no. She never disciplines him. She enables every single one of his worst impulses because she is terrified of conflict with her own child. And the result is a kid who, by age 9, has genuinely no understanding that other people's feelings are real, not in the abstract kids are selfish way, in the clinical, diagnosable way. Look at what Cartman does across the series. I'm not even going to talk about Scott Tenorman yet. We already opened with that, and we'll come back to it. Let's talk about the smaller thing. In Cartman Sucks, Season 11, Episode 2, which aired March 14th, 2007, Cartman invites Butters over for sleepovers, specifically so he can pull degrading pranks on him while he's unconscious. And the prank he pulls, which I won't describe in detail because it's genuinely one of the most disturbing things the show has depicted, is so inappropriate that when his friends find out, Kyle has to explain to Cartman that he's actually humiliated himself, not Butters. Cartman is so psychologically warped that he can't even understand why his own prank backfired. And here's the key detail. Cartman's not doing this because he's angry at Butters. He's not getting revenge for anything. He just thinks it's entertaining. The power imbalance is the whole point for him. The fact that Butters is completely unaware of what's happening is what makes it satisfying. That's not normal childhood misbehavior. That's something much darker. And the show treats it that way. The plot spirals into Butters being sent to a conversion camp because his father misinterprets the situation. The episode ends up being a surprisingly sharp critique of how adults project their anxieties onto children. But Cartman's role in all of it is never about confusion or misunderstanding. It's about control. It's always about control with Cartman. Here's where it gets really interesting psychologically. In 1998, for Spin Magazine's March cover feature, a child psychologist named Dr. Ave Siegler was asked to analyze the 4 main South Park boys. About Cartman, she said she would recommend play therapy, and that she'd try to point out the way he cheats and makes himself feel big and strong by making other people small and weak. She described him as a boy who, underneath, has enormously poor self-esteem. She suggested he could end up as a military monster, or become depressed, and just get fatter and isolate himself. That was before Season 2 even aired, and she was describing the exact trajectory the character would follow for the next 25 years. Because Cartman does have poor self-esteem. It's buried under layers and layers of grandiosity and cruelty, but it's there. You see it in the moments when the facade cracks, when nobody wants to come to his birthday party, when he discovers his mom has been lying to him about who his father is, when he genuinely can't understand why people don't like him. There's a scene, and I can't remember the exact episode, but it's one of the earlier seasons, where Cartman is sitting alone in his room, and he's just talking to himself in his Clyde Frog's voice, having an imaginary conversation where his stuffed animals tell him he's cool and liked. That's not a supervillain. That's a profoundly lonely child who has constructed an entire false reality to protect himself from the truth that nobody wants to be around him. But, and this is crucial, the show never lets that be an excuse. Because the thing about Cartman that makes him genuinely terrifying, the thing that separates him from just being the mean kid, is his intelligence. Cartman is smart, really smart, and he uses that intelligence exclusively in the service of manipulation, cruelty, and self-interest. Scott Tenorman Must Die is the proof of concept. That episode, Season 5, Episode 4, is the one where Cartman stopped being a bratty kid and became something else. Trey Parker himself said on the DVD commentary that this episode definitely changed Cartman, taking him from kind of a little jerk to probably the most evil kid in the world. And the episode's structure proves it. Cartman's revenge plan isn't impulsive. It's a chess game. He knows Stan and Kyle will betray him. He accounts for it. He uses it. He's playing a game that nobody else even knows they're in. He gets Farmer Dinkins to shoot Scott's parents by warning him about trespassers. He steals the body. He chops them up. He makes chili. He invites Radiohead. And then he sits there and watches Scott eat his own parent, and he smiles. The production history of that episode is interesting too. Unlike most South Park episodes, which are famously created in about 6 days, writing on Scott Tenorman Must Die started in the middle of May 2001, more than a month before the season premiere on June 20th. Parker and Stone said they struggled with it because the episode only had one plot, the escalating war between Cartman and Scott, and they feared that not having a subplot would hurt it. But when they finished, they realized a single, strong storyline worked well, and many subsequent episodes adopted the same approach. And then, years later, the show retroactively makes Cartman's actions even more disturbing. In season 14's 201, we learn that Scott Tenorman's father, Jack Tenorman, was actually Cartman's biological father, which means Cartman murdered his own father and fed him to his half-brother. And when Cartman finds out, he's not horrified because he killed his dad. He's horrified because it means he's part ginger. That response tells you everything you need to know about his psychology. The narcissism is so complete, so total, that even patricide doesn't register as a moral event. It only registers as a threat to his identity. I've been sitting with that detail for weeks now, and I think it's one of the most psychologically sophisticated things any comedy has ever done. Because what it reveals is that Cartman's moral framework doesn't just have gaps in it. It literally doesn't exist. He doesn't have a broken moral compass. He doesn't have a moral compass at all. There's nothing there. Just self-interest all the way down. And look, I know some people are going to push back on this and say, he's just a cartoon. It's just jokes. And yeah, on one level, of course he is. But Trey Parker has described the character as a little Archie Bunker, and TV Guide ranked him 10th on their list of the 50 greatest cartoon characters in 2002. MSNBC's Brian Belmont called him the second scariest character on television, behind only Mr. Byrne. Bravo listed him at number 19 on their 100 Greatest TV Characters special in 2004. This character has been analyzed and discussed by experts in politics, religion, popular culture, and philosophy. The show has spent nearly 3 decades carefully evolving him, and what they've built is, in my opinion, one of the most psychologically complete characters in all of animation, maybe in all of television. But you know who I think is even more psychologically interesting than Cartman? And I know that's a controversial take, but hear me out. Kyle Broflovsky. Here's the thing about Kyle that a lot of people miss. Kyle is not the good guy. Kyle thinks he's the good guy, and there's a massive difference. Kyle is the kid who gives the "I learned something today" speech at the end of episode. He's the one who stands up to Cartman's scheme. He's the moral compass, right? Well, kind of. Because Kyle's morality is not as clean as it appears, and the show has been slowly deconstructing it for years. Kyle is voiced by and loosely based on series co-creator Matt Stone. He first appeared on August 13th, 1997, when South Park debuted. He's the only Jewish kid in South Park, and his Jewish identity is a massive part of his character. Not just because Cartman targets him for it, but because it gives him a framework for understanding right and wrong that the other kids don't have. Kyle genuinely wrestles with ethical questions. He genuinely cares about doing the right thing. But, and this is where it gets complicated, Kyle also has a terrible temper. He has a superiority complex, and he has a pattern of abandoning his morals the second there's something in it for him. Crack Baby Athletic Association, Season 15, Episode 5. Kyle starts out completely opposed to the exploitation of crack-addicted baby, and then he finds out how much money is involved. And suddenly, he's running the operation, justifying it to himself, telling Stan and everyone else that it's actually good for the baby. That's not a mistake or a lapse in judgment. That's a pattern. Kyle's moral outrage is often performative, driven by a need to feel superior rather than a genuine commitment to doing right. The show recognized this as early as toilet paper in Season 7, where Kyle is consumed with guilt over toilet papering their art teacher's house. But the moment he hears he can get a better offer by staying quiet, the guilt evaporates. And here's what I think is the key to understanding Kyle's psychology. His rivalry with Cartman is not just hero versus villain. It's two sides of the same coin. Cartman represents total selfishness with no moral pretense. Kyle represents moral pretense that often conceals selfishness. They need each other. Cartman needs someone to push against, someone who will be outraged by his action, because the outrage is part of what makes it satisfying for him. And Kyle needs Cartman to exist, because Cartman makes Kyle feel morally superior, which is Kyle's primary psychological need. Without Cartman, Kyle would have to confront the fact that he's not actually as good as he thinks he is. And the show explores this beautifully in the Heidi Turner arc during seasons 20 and 21. Kyle tries to save Heidi from Cartman's emotional abuse, and at first, it looks heroic. But then the show reveals that Kyle's interest in saving Heidi is at least partially about Kyle himself, about proving he's better than Cartman, about being the hero, about getting the girl. And when Heidi rejects Kyle's help and goes back to Cartman, Kyle says something that cuts through everything. "I would never have the hots for the person you are now." And Heidi is stunned, because what Kyle just did is exactly what Cartman does. He used someone's vulnerability as a weapon. The delivery was different, the intention was different, but the mechanism was the same. Matt Stone has said that both he and the character are reactionary and susceptible to irritability and impatience. And that word, reactionary, is important because Kyle doesn't choose his moral positions so much as he reacts to them. He sees something wrong and he lights up. But that fire burns out quickly when there's no audience, no enemy, no Cartman to define himself again. There's actually a fascinating parallel between Kyle and his mother, Sheila Broflovsky. Sheila is the character who starts war, literal wars, because of her moral outrage. She's the one who almost got Terrence and Philip executed in the movie. She's the one who, in episode after episode, uses moral authority as a cudgel, and Kyle inherited that. He inherited the righteous fury, the absolute certainty, the inability to consider that he might be wrong. The difference is that Kyle, unlike his mother, does occasionally recognize it. He does occasionally have moments of self-awareness. And those moments, those brief flashes where Kyle sees himself clearly, are some of the most interesting character beats in the entire show. Okay, I need to slow down and talk about someone who doesn't get nearly enough credit for being one of the most psychologically sophisticated characters in South Park's history, Kenny McCormick. Here's the thing about Kenny that drives me a little crazy. When I see people talk about this show, Kenny is not a prop. I know that in the early seasons, that's basically what he was. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have even admitted it. When they temporarily killed Kenny off at the end of season 5 in Kenny Dies, they said they'd grown tired of the death gag and viewed the character as a prop. But then Kenny came back. And more importantly, the show started exploring what it would actually mean to be a kid who dies and comes back to life over and over again. And what they found was one of the most interesting psychological concepts in the entire series. In the season 14 episode, Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends, that's episodes 11 through 14, airing October and November 2010. Kenny reveals himself as the superhero Mysterion, and his superpower is immortality. He can't stay dead. He dies, wakes up in his bed, and nobody remembers it happened. Not Stan, not Kyle, not Cartman, nobody. And Kenny is furious about this. He kills himself in front of his friends to prove it, and the next day they don't remember. Think about the psychological implications of that. Kenny experiences death, the most traumatic thing a human being can experience, regularly, repeatedly. And then he has to go on living knowing that nobody else acknowledges it. Nobody grieves for him. Nobody even remembers. The show explains this by suggesting his parents attended a cult of Cthulhu before he was born, and his mother gives birth to him anew each time he dies. She mutters under her breath, "I knew we should have never gone to those cult meetings." So Kenny's immortality is framed not as a gift, but as a curse, a burden that isolates him from the people he cares about. And here's what I find really powerful about the Mysterion arc. Kenny, as Mysterion, is the most heroic version of any of the boys. He's selfless. He's principled. He protects his little sister Karen with ferocious intensity. At the end of Coon vs. Coon and Friends, he offers himself up to Cthulhu, saying that only an immortal can kill another immortal. He makes the ultimate sacrifice, and it means nothing because he'll just wake up again, and the people he sacrificed himself for won't remember. I've been turning this over in my head for a while, and I think Kenny's psychology is actually the most interesting case study in the whole show. Because Kenny doesn't just endure poverty. His father Stuart is an alcoholic. His family can barely eat. Cartman constantly mocks his economic status. He endures a kind of existential horror that nobody else in his world can even comprehend. He dies. He experiences oblivion. And then he comes back and has to sit on the bus next to kids who have no idea what he's been through. And yet, he's not bitter. He's not broken. He's vulgar, and he's obsessed with sex, and he's a troublemaker. But when it counts, Kenny consistently makes the most selfless choices of any of the four boys. There's a reading of Kenny's character that I think is really compelling, that his recklessness, his hypersexuality, his constant desire for sensation is actually a coping mechanism for someone who has been traumatized beyond what any human psyche should be able to handle. He seeks out intensity because intensity is the only thing that makes him feel alive in between death. And his heroism as Mysterion is the flip side of the same coin. It's a way of giving his deaths meaning. If he's going to die anyway, he might as well die saving someone. Dr. Siegler, the child psychologist who analyzed the boys for Spin in 1998, described Kenny as a kid who appears to be selectively mute, and noted that selective muteness usually has to do with underlying aggression. She said it was interesting that Kenny becomes the kid with aggression problems when he's aggressed against in every episode. That was before the show had even developed Kenny's mythology, but she was onto something. Kenny's silent, his muffled, incomprehensible speech through that orange parka is itself a psychological symptom. He literally cannot be heard. Nobody listens to him. Nobody remembers him. He's invisible in every way that matters. And the show built an entire mythology around that invisibility. And now, I need to talk about the character who might be the emotional heart of the entire show. The one who, in a cast full of cynics and sociopaths and depressives, somehow maintains an almost supernatural level of optimism. Leopold Butters Stotch. If you've been watching South Park for any amount of time, you already know that Butters is the one the show treats the worst, and who somehow always comes out the other side with his spirit intact. And I think there's a tendency to view that as just a running gag. Butters gets screwed over. Isn't that funny? But if you look at what the show has actually been building with Butters over 28 seasons, it's something much more complex, and honestly, kind of heartbreaking. Butters is voiced by Matt Stone, and first appeared as a background character in the very first episode on August 13, 1997. He didn't have a name for years. He was just that kid in the background with the light blue shirt. But starting around season 3, his role gradually increased, and by season 6, after Kenny's temporary death, Butters became the de facto fourth member of the group. And what the show discovered in that period was that Butters was funnier, more versatile, and more emotionally resonant than they'd expected. Parker and Stone have both said he's one of their favorite characters to write, and the reason he's so compelling is his home life. Steven and Linda Stotch are, by any reasonable standard, abusive parent. They ground Butters for everything. They ground him for things that aren't his fault. They ground him for things that are completely beyond his control. His mother, Linda, at one point tried to drown him in a car. His father, Steven, was caught at a gay bathhouse, sold Butters to Paris Hilton for $250 million, and has been caught lying about his own behavior while punishing Butters for far less. And in Butterballs, season 16, episode 5, we learn that Butters' grandmother physically and psychologically bullies him when nobody's looking. And here's what makes Butters' psychology so fascinating. He knows he's being mistreated. He's not oblivious to it. In Super Fun Time, he punches his dad in the groin and says it's for all the times he was grounded. In later seasons, he tells Cartman to his face to go to hell. But despite all of this, Butters remains fundamentally kind, optimistic, and trusting. And the show doesn't treat that as stupidity. It treats it as a choice, a deliberate, conscious decision to remain open to the world, despite everything the world has done to him. And that brings us back to Raisin, and the speech that I think is one of the most important moments in the entire series. Butters has just been dumped by Lexus, the Raisin's waitress, who was only ever interested in his money. He's devastated. He's crying in the rain. The goth kids find him and invite him to join their group. And Butters says, well, yeah, and I'm sad, but at the same time, I'm really happy that something could make me feel that sad. It's like, it makes me feel alive, you know? It makes me feel human. And the only way I could feel this sad now is if I felt something really good before. So I have to take the bad with the good. So I guess what I'm feeling is like a beautiful sadness. I need to sit with that for a second. Because in a show that is famous for cynicism, for ripping apart everything and everyone, for having no sacred cows, that speech is completely sincere. There's no irony in it. There's no punchline coming. Butters means every word. And Stan, who has been wallowing in his own depression for the entire episode, hears it and something changes. He tells the goth kids, I don't even know who I am anymore. I liked liking life a lot more than hating it. Screw you guys, I'm going home. Tim Kaine of the Herald and Review called Butters' speech one of the most heartfelt and sincere soliloquies in the show's history. And the reason it works is because Butters has earned it. This is a kid who has been abused, manipulated, exploited, and ignored for his entire life. And he's choosing to feel the pain rather than shut it out. He's choosing vulnerability over cynicism. And in the context of South Park, where every character is a cynic or a monster or a fraud. That's revolutionary. But the show is also honest about what that kind of sustained abuse does to a person, because Butters also becomes Professor Chaos. In Professor Chaos, Season 6, Episode 6, which aired April 10th, 2002, the boys kick Butters out of the group for being too lame, and Butters, standing alone in his room, remembering all the things he did for them, buying tampons, going on Maury Povich with balls on his chin, snaps. He puts on a cape and a tinfoil helmet and declares himself a supervillain who will bring chaos to the world. And here's what the show does brilliantly. Professor Chaos is pathetic. His evil schemes are switching menu orders at Bennigan and stealing chalkboard erasers. He's convinced the liberal media is covering up his crime. His sidekick is a kindergartner named Dougie, who calls himself General Disarray. It's hilarious. But underneath the comedy, what you're watching is a child who has been broken by rejection and is trying, desperately, to feel powerful in a world that has told him he doesn't matter. Professor Chaos is Butters' way of screaming into the void. It doesn't work. It can't work. But the need behind it, the need to be seen, to matter, to have agency, that's real. And in the post-COVID special, the show takes this to its darkest conclusion. Adult Butters, now calling himself Victor Chaos, has been locked in his room by his parents for 16 years. They abandoned him, and he's become genuinely insane. It's the show saying, yes, all of that abuse had consequences. Yes, if you take the sweetest kid in the world and grind him down for decades, this is what happened. The optimism breaks. The beautiful sadness becomes just sadness. All right, I've been going for a while now, and if you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a light video. But I can't talk about the psychology of South Park without talking about the character who might represent the show's most fascinating psychological case study of the adult world, Randy Marsh. Randy has gone through one of the most dramatic character evolutions in television history, and I don't think people fully appreciate how deliberate it is. In the early seasons, season 1 through maybe season 6 or 7, Randy is basically just Stan's dad. He's a geologist. He's a little doofy. He gives a geologist. He's a little doofy. He gives Stan awkward talks about puberty. He's fine, normal, maybe a bit dimmer than he should be, but fundamentally, a reasonable adult. And then something shifts. Somewhere around season 8, Randy starts getting more screen time, more B-plot, more absurd behavior. And at first, it's incredible. The Losing Edge, season 9, episode 5, where Randy gets into fights at Stan's baseball games because the boys are trying to lose, that's an all-time classic Randy episode. He's hilarious. His alcoholic rage at other dads is one of the funniest things the show has ever done. But here's what's happening underneath the comedy. Randy is getting dumber, deliberately, visibly dumber, and more obsessive, and more selfish. Season after season, he picks up a new fad or fixation and throws himself into it completely. Metrosexuality, being a celebrity chef, fighting at baseball game, producing music as Lord, owning a Blockbuster Video in the streaming era. And each time, the fixation is total. He abandons his responsibility, embarrasses his family, and doesn't care. The show addresses this directly in You're Getting Old. When Sharon confronts Randy about his behavior, he snaps and admits that he's been unhappy for a long time, that his increasingly ridiculous behavior is a coping mechanism for a marriage and a life that have stopped making him happy. That's real. That's painfully real. And it reframes everything Randy has done up to that point. He's not just a funny idiot dad. He's a man in crisis who doesn't know how to fix his life, so he keeps blowing it up in new and spectacular ways. And then comes Tegrity Farms. Season 22, Episode 4. Tegrity Farm. Randy moves his family to the countryside and starts growing cannabis. And this storyline lasted from 2018 until Season 27's Sycophancy in 2025. When Randy finally sold the farm. 7 years. 7 years of Randy running a marijuana farm, becoming increasingly unethical, increasingly detached from his family, increasingly unrecognizable from the geologist dad we met in Season 1. And the show knows it's too much. They acknowledged it in the post-COVID specials, where future Randy is pathetic and alone. They acknowledged it in the streaming wars, where they split Randy into his old self and his Karen self, literally depicting his transformation as a personality disorder. Fans wanted the Tegrity storyline retired almost from the moment it became clear it was sticking around, because it consumed so much of the show and pushed the kids to the background. But here's what I think is interesting about Randy from a psychological perspective. His trajectory mirrors what happens to a lot of men in middle age. He's looking for meaning. He's looking for identity. His career as a geologist wasn't fulfilling enough. His marriage was stale. His kids were growing up. And instead of doing the hard, boring work of introspection and growth, he kept chasing the next shiny thing. Weed farming, music, fighting, whatever filled the void that week. And the show is saying, through Randy, that this isn't funny. I mean, it is funny. Randy is hilarious. But underneath the comedy, it's tragic. It's a portrait of a man who can't sit still with himself. Trey Parker has said that as he and Matt Stone got older, they started relating more to the adult characters than the kid, and Randy became the vehicle for that. Parker's father is named Randy and is a geologist. The character started as a direct reference, but over time, Randy became Parker's way of exploring his own anxieties about aging, about relevance, about becoming the kind of person he used to mock. And that's what makes South Park's psychology so fascinating. The characters aren't static. They evolve, they get worse, they occasionally get better, and they do it in ways that feel human, even when they're made of construction paper. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the supporting characters whose psychology adds so much texture to this show. Because South Park isn't just the four boys and Randy. It's an entire town full of people who are all, in their own way, completely messed up. Mister. Garrison might be the single most psychologically complex character on the show. And I'm not saying that because of his gender transition, though those are certainly part of it. I'm saying it because Garrison's character arc, from the very first episode on August 13th, 1997, through his presidency, through his return to teaching, encompasses more psychological territory than most characters cover in entire franchises. In the early seasons, Garrison is a closeted gay man who channels his repressed sexuality through a hand puppet named Mr. Hat. And Mr. Hat sometimes acts independently, suggesting that Garrison has some form of dissociative identity. The puppet says and does things that Garrison won't allow himself to say and do. It's a textbook defense mechanism, and the show treats it partly as comedy and partly as genuine psychological horror. In one episode, Mr. Hat joins the Ku Klux Klan. In another, he commits crimes that Garrison disavows, but clearly orchestrated. Then, Garrison comes out as gay. Then he gets a sex change operation in Season 9, Episode 1, Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina. Then he gets it reversed in Season 12. Then he discovers he can't have children and mourns a biological impossibility. Then he falls in love, loses love, teaches, gets fired, and eventually, in Season 19, becomes a political candidate modeled on Donald Trump, running on a platform of literally violating all immigrants to death. Trey Parker has said that Garrison is the soap opera element to the whole series, and that the character has a real story going on. And he's right. Garrison's story is about a person who has never been comfortable in his own skin, who has tried on identity after identity. Teacher, gay man, woman, man again, politician, president, looking for the one that fits. And none of them fit. Not really. Because Garrison's fundamental problem isn't his gender or his sexuality. It's his complete inability to find peace within himself. He's perpetually in conflict with who he is, and he takes that conflict out on everyone around him. Parker and Stone never expected Garrison as Trump to actually win the presidency. They'd planned for him to lose and return to teaching, humbled. When Trump actually won in November 2016, they had to scramble to rewrite the final episodes of Season 20. And the result is honestly fascinating. They show Garrison as president, being horrified at his own power, realizing he has no idea what he's doing, and doubling down anyway. That's not just political satire. That's a character study of what happens when someone who has spent their entire life seeking authority finally gets it and discovers it doesn't fill the hole. And then for Season 27, Parker and Stone made the decision to bring back the real Donald Trump as a character, rather than using Garrison as a stand-in. And Garrison returned to South Park, returned to teaching, started dating a man named Rick. And it feels like the show is finally, after decades, letting Garrison find some kind of stability, which, knowing South Park, probably won't last. Let me talk about a couple of other characters whose psychology adds something important to the show. Tweek and Craig. These two started as minor characters. Tweek is the twitchy, caffeine-addicted kid whose parents own a coffee shop. Craig as the deadpan, middle-finger-flipping kid who doesn't care about anything. And then, in Season 19, the show did something unexpected. In Tweek x Craig, the boys are paired together in an Asian fetish art project, and everyone in town assumes they're a couple. And instead of making it a joke about misunderstanding, the show actually develops a genuine romantic relationship between them. And what's interesting about Tweek and Craig psychologically is how they complement each other. Tweek is anxiety personified. He's jittery, paranoid, terrified of everything. His parents literally feed him coffee and tell him scary stories to make him more anxious. And Craig is the opposite. He's flat, unemotional, almost apathetic. And the show suggests that they work because Tweek's anxiety is grounded by Craig's stability, and Craig's emotional flatness is warmed by Tweek's intensity. It's a surprisingly tender depiction of how people with opposite emotional profiles can be good for each other. And in an era where children's media was still largely avoiding same-sex relationships, South Park of all shows treated this one with genuine respect. That caught a lot of people off guard. Jimmy Valmer is another character whose psychology is worth examining. Jimmy is physically disabled. He uses crutches. And the show could easily have made him either a token or a victim. Instead, Jimmy is one of the most confident, self-assured characters on the show. He's a comedian. He loves the spotlight. He takes genuine pride in his work and is devastated when he thinks it's been compromised, like in Cripple Fight or Fish Sticks, Season 13, Episode 5, where the authorship of a joke he co-wrote with Cartman becomes a major controversy. Jimmy's psychology is about creative ego and the desperate need for artistic validation. He's not defined by his disability. He's defined by his ambition. And then there's Wendy Testaberger, who I think is one of the most underappreciated characters on the show. Wendy is smart, driven, politically engaged, and genuinely principled in a way that Kyle only pretends to be. She's the one who beats up Cartman in Breast Cancer Show Ever, Season 12, Episode 9. She's the one who actually follows through on her conviction. And her relationship with Stan is one of the show's longest running dynamic. They're together, they break up, they get back together, they break up again. And Wendy's consistent frustration with Stan's passivity is itself a psychological portrait. She keeps trying to be with someone who can't match her emotional intensity, and she keeps being disappointed, and she stays anyway. That's its own kind of pattern. Okay, I want to bring this back to something broader, because I've been talking about individual characters, but I think the really interesting thing about South Park's psychology isn't just the characters, it's the town. South Park as a place has a psychology, and that psychology is groupthink. If you watch enough episodes, and believe me, I've watched a lot of episodes putting this together, you start to notice a pattern. The adults of South Park will latch onto a thing, anything, and go completely insane about it. Metrosexuality, the Food Network, gluten, Yelp reviews, member berries. It doesn't matter what it is. The town acts as a single organism, and the organism is stupid. The adults panic in unison. They form mobs in unison. They abandon reason in unison. And then, usually, one of the kids, typically Stan or Kyle, has to stand up and explain why they're all being idiots. This isn't accidental. This is the show's core thesis about human psychology. Matt and Trey have been making the same argument for nearly 30 years. Most people don't think for themselves. Most people follow the crowd. Most people will believe anything, do anything, and abandon anything if enough other people are doing it too. And the only people who see clearly are the ones who haven't been socialized into that pattern yet. Children. Children who are still young enough to look at the world and say, this is stupid, without worrying about what other people think. That's why the show always returns to the kid. That's why, even when Randy is dominating the screen time, even when Garrison is president, even when Tegrity Farms is consuming the narrative, the emotional core of the show is always those four boys standing at a bus stop, looking at the world around them, and trying to make sense of it. And I think that's actually a pretty profound psychological insight, because South Park isn't saying that children are wise. Kyle is a self-righteous hypocrite. Cartman is a sociopath. Stan is a depressive alcoholic in the making. Kenny dies repeatedly and nobody cared. They're not sages, they're kids, but they haven't yet developed the capacity for the kind of mass delusion that the adults specialize in. They can still see clearly, even if what they see horrifies them. I've been thinking about this a lot. The whole theme of You're Getting Old is essentially asking, what happens when you start seeing clearly and you can't stop? When the illusions that make life bearable stop working. Stan's depression isn't caused by something going wrong. It's caused by him seeing things as they are. And the show's answer, drink or go back to the illusion, is bleak, but it's honest. And that honesty is, I think, what separates South Park from every other animated comedy. The Simpsons is warmer, Family Guy is zanier, Bob's Burgers is gentler, but none of them are willing to look at you and say, the reason you're unhappy might be that you're right about everything being terrible. Let me talk about a few more characters before we start wrapping this up, because there are some supporting players whose psychology adds crucial depth to the show. Chef Jerome Chef McElroy, voiced by Isaac Hayes from the pilot until 2006, was the one adult in South Park who genuinely cared about the kids and gave them real advice. He was their emotional anchor. When they had questions about life, about relationship, about anything that mattered, they went to Chef. And his absence, Hayes quit the show after the Scientology episode, Trapped in the Closet, in Season 9. And Chef was killed off in the Season 10 premiere, The Return of Chef, on March 22nd, 2006, left a hole that the show has never filled. The kids lost their one reliable adult. And I think you can trace a direct line from Chef's death to the increasing darkness of the kids' storylines in subsequent seasons. Without Chef, there is no adult in South Park who these kids can trust. Not their parent, not their teacher, not Mr. Mackey, who means well, but is consistently useless. Nobody. The kids are on their own. And that has psychological consequences. Look at how the boys handle problems before Chef's death versus after. In the earlier season, they'd go to Chef. He'd sing them a song. He'd give them advice that was inappropriate, but came from a genuine place of love, and they'd figure things out. After Chef dies, the boys have to figure everything out on their own, and they make worse decisions. They're meaner, they're more cynical, they trust adults less. The loss of their one trusted adult made them harder, and I don't think that was accidental on the writer's part. Mr. Mackey, the school counselor who ends every sentence with McKay, is another interesting psychological portrait. Here's a man whose literal job is to help children with their emotional and psychological problem, and he is comically, catastrophically bad at it. When Stan is depressed in Asperger's, Mackey tells him his attitude is bringing everyone down, and he should snap out of it. When kids are traumatized, Mackey offers platitude. He's not malicious. He genuinely cares about the student, but he's in over his head. He doesn't have the tool, and the show uses him to make a point about the inadequacy of institutional support for children's mental health. The system is there, the counselor is there, the office is there, but none of it works. And the kids know it doesn't work, which is why they never go to Mackey with anything real. PC Principal is a character I initially hated, but have come to appreciate as a psychological study. Introduced in season 19, 2015, PC Principal is a large, aggressive man who enforces political correctness through intimidation. And at first, he seems like a one-note satire of progressive culture, but the show has given him layers. He genuinely believes in inclusivity. He genuinely wants to make the school better. But his methods, screaming at people, threatening violence, refusing to hear dissent, are the exact opposite of the values he espouses. He's a bully in the name of anti-bullying. And that tension is psychologically interesting. He represents the phenomenon of people whose passion for justice becomes indistinguishable from the authoritarianism they claim to oppose. And then there's Tolkien Black. The show renamed the character from Token to Tolkien in season 25's The Big Fix, retroactively changing the spelling and making fun of fans who'd assumed for years it was about tokenism. Tolkien is the richest kid in South Park. He's also one of the most emotionally stable, and the show has increasingly used him as a foil for Stan specifically. Tolkien is everything Stan wishes he could be: confident, secure, not prone to depression or existential crisis. And Stan's resentment of that, his confusion about why his friendship with Tolkien is complicated, is itself a portrait of a kid struggling with insecurity and social comparison. I keep coming back to this idea that South Park is a show about psychology disguised as a show about profanity, because the more you watch it, the more you realize that almost every episode is about a psychological concept: groupthink, narcissism, depression, addiction, identity formation, moral reasoning, coping mechanism, projection, displacement. The show rarely names these concepts directly. It's not that kind of show, but they're embedded in the DNA of every story. Take an episode like Gnomes, Season 2, Episode 17, The Underpants. Gnomes have a business plan. Step 1, steal underpants. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, profit. It's a famous joke, but psychologically, it's a satire of how people rationalize incomplete thinking. We do this all the time. We come up with Step 1 and Step 3 and skip right over the hard part. And the gnomes are a visual metaphor for that cognitive shortcut. Or take Margaritaville, Season 13, Episode 3, which aired March 25th, 2009, during the financial crisis. The episode equates the economy to a religion. People worship it, pray to it, make sacrifices to it, and punish heretics who question it. Kyle literally becomes an economic Jesus figure who takes on the town's debt. And what the show is exploring is the psychology of economic panic, how people treat financial systems with the same irrational devotion and fear they bring to religion. It's a surprisingly sophisticated critique of how humans process large-scale systemic uncertainty. Or Make Love Not Warcraft, Season 10, Episode 8, which aired October 4th, 2006, and which won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program. On the surface, it's a hilarious episode about the boys playing World of Warcraft, but psychologically, it's about addiction and escapism. The boys become so consumed by the game that they physically deteriorate. They gain weight. They stop socializing. They stop caring about the real world. And the show doesn't judge them for it, exactly, but it does show the cost. And the final line, where they finally defeat the griefer And Stan asks, "What do we do now?" And Cartman says, "What do you mean? Now we can finally play the game." That's a devastating critique of how addiction works. You spend all your energy getting the thing, and when you get it, it's empty. So you just keep going. I've been working on this video for a long time, and I've rewatched more South Park in the past few weeks than I have in years. And the thing that keeps striking me is how consistent the show's psychological framework is across nearly 3 decades. The characters change, the topics change, the animation quality changes, but the underlying view of human nature remains constant. People are foolish, selfish, fearful, and tribal. They follow crowds. They seek comfort over truth. They treat their children terribly. They refuse to learn from their mistakes. And yet, somehow, in the middle of all that dysfunction, genuine moments of connection, kindness, and insight still happen, usually from the people you least expect. That's Butters giving his beautiful sadness speech. That's Kenny sacrificing himself for his friend. That's Stan crying in Mr. Mackey's office because nothing makes him happy anymore. That's Kyle standing up to Cartman even though he knows it won't change anything. Those moments aren't the exception to South Park's cynicism. They're the point of it. The show tears everything down so that the things left standing, the real thing, the human thing, stand out more clearly. And if you think about it, that's kind of what good psychology does too. It strips away the defenses, the narratives, the self-deception, until you're left with the raw material of who you actually are. South Park does that to its characters every week. And sometimes, if you're watching closely enough, it does it to you too. Okay, let me talk about a few more threads before we wind this down, because I'd feel guilty leaving some of these out. The Coon and Friends saga, and I keep coming back to this, is one of the most psychologically rich storylines in the entire series. Because what it does is take the 4 boys and force them to reveal who they really are, through the lens of superhero alter ego. Stan is Toolshed, practical, utilitarian, boring. Kyle is the human kite, named unfortunately close to a slur, flying high but tethered. Cartman is the coon. He literally named himself after a raccoon, but chose a word that has racial connotation, because of course he did. And Kenny is Mysterion, the dark, mysterious, tragic hero. And the dynamics between their superhero identities mirror their real psychological dynamics perfectly. Cartman wants to be the leader, and throws a tantrum when he isn't. Kyle tries to do the right thing, but gets sidelined. Stan goes along with whatever the group decides. And Kenny is the one who actually has power, who actually makes sacrifices, who actually matter, but nobody acknowledges it. His contributions are invisible, just like in real life. The show even uses the superhero framework to explore Cartman's relationship with authority. When Cartman is kicked out of Coon and Friends for being too controlling, he doesn't just leave. He teams up with Cthulhu, a literal Lovecraftian elder god, and uses cosmic power to destroy things that personally annoy him. His response to being rejected by a group of 4th graders is to seek out the most powerful force in the universe and weaponize it for petty revenge. That's narcissistic rage, distilled to its purest form. And the show plays it for laugh, obviously, but the psychology underneath is airtight. I also want to briefly mention the season 20 arc with Heidi Turner and online trolling, because I think it's one of the show's most sophisticated psychological storylines. Heidi quits social media and starts dating Cartman. And at first, it seems like Cartman might actually be capable of a real relationship. He's sweet to her. He seems to care. But gradually, over the course of 2 seasons, the show depicts a textbook emotionally abusive relationship. Cartman gaslights Heidi. He undermines her confidence. He makes her feel like she can't survive without him. He turns her against her friend. And Heidi, who started as a smart, independent girl, slowly becomes a diminished version of herself. And the really devastating thing is how the show depicts the difficulty of leaving. Kyle tries to help. He tells Heidi the truth about Cartman, and Heidi goes back to Cartman anyway, because that's what happens in abusive relationships. The pattern is too strong. The psychology of dependence is too deep. And the show doesn't simplify this or resolve it cleanly. It lets it be messy and frustrating and heartbreaking, just like real life. Remember earlier when I talked about how Kyle's attempt to save Heidi was partly about his own ego? This is where that comes full circle, because the show is making a point that even well-intentioned intervention can be about the intervener's need rather than the victim. Kyle wants to save Heidi because it would prove he's better than Cartman, and Heidi senses that. She senses that Kyle's help comes with strings attached, and that makes Cartman, who at least is honest about being terrible, seem paradoxically more trustworthy. The psychology of abuse is that the abuser creates a world where only they make sense. And Cartman, master manipulator that he is, does exactly that. All right, I think we're approaching the end of this, and I want to bring it all together. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing that I think connects every character we've talked about tonight is the concept of coping. That's what South Park is really about, psychologically. Every character has a way of coping with the fundamental difficulty of being alive, and every one of those coping mechanisms is flawed. Stan copes by numbing himself, alcohol, cynicism, withdrawal. Kyle copes by performing morality, righteous outrage, superiority. Cartman copes by dominating, manipulation, cruelty, control. Kenny copes by seeking sensation, heroism, recklessness, intimacy. Butters copes by maintaining innocence, optimism, forgiveness, beautiful sadness. Randy copes by chasing novelty, obsession, reinvention, escape. Garrison copes by rejecting identity, transformation, authority, destruction. And the town of South Park itself copes by conforming, groupthink, panic, scapegoating. None of these strategies work. Not really, not long term. And the show knows it. That's why nothing in South Park permanently improved. That's why the reset button exists. Not because the show is lazy, though sometimes it is, but because the psychological reality it's depicting is cyclical. People develop coping mechanisms. The coping mechanisms fail. People develop new coping mechanisms. Those fail too. And the cycle continues. But, and this is important, the show doesn't present this as hopeless. Because within that cycle, there are moments of genuine connection. Stan and Kyle at the bus stop. Kenny protecting Karen, Butters choosing to feel the pain. Even Cartman, in his very rare moments of vulnerability, reaching out to the one person who might understand him, which frighteningly is usually Kyle. Those moments don't fix anything. They don't break the cycle, but they make the cycle bearable. And maybe that's enough. And maybe that's what Matt and Trey have been saying all along. Across 28 seasons and over 300 episodes and special, through all the profanity and the controversy and the animation and the 6-day production cycle, maybe they've been saying, life is hard. People are flawed. Your coping mechanisms will fail you. But if you're lucky, you'll find a few people who make the failure tolerable. And if you're really lucky, you'll find a moment. Standing in the rain, crying over a girl who never loved you, looking at your friends who can't understand your pain, where you realize that the sadness itself is proof that you're alive, that you felt something good once, and that even though it hurts now, the fact that it can hurt is beautiful. That's Butters' philosophy. And I think it might be the show's philosophy too. I want to leave you with one last thought. There's a detail about South Park that I think gets overlooked, and it's this. Every episode of this show is made in approximately 6 days, from writing to animation to voice acting to airing. 6 days. The documentary 6 Days to Air from 2011 showed this process in detail. And what that means is that every psychological insight, every character moment, every piece of emotional depth we've been discussing tonight was created under extreme time pressure by a small team of people who were exhausted and stressed and probably running on caffeine and panic. And that's kind of perfect, isn't it? Because South Park isn't polished. It's not carefully planned out seasons in advance, like Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones. It's reactive, it's messy, it's impulsive. It's exactly like the characters it depicts. And yet, out of that chaos, something genuine keeps emerging, something true, something that millions of people around the world have connected with for nearly 30 years. I think that says something about psychology too. That insight doesn't require perfect condition. That truth can come out of chaos. That sometimes the most honest thing you can say is the thing you didn't have time to overthink. South Park has been saying honest things in chaotic ways since 1997, and I think that's why we keep watching. Not because it's crude, not because it's offensive, not because it's funny, though it is often really, really funny, but because somewhere underneath the construction paper and the fart jokes and the dead Kennys and the Cartman scheme, there's a show that understands how people actually work, how they fail, how they cope, how they hurt each other, and how, every once in a while, they surprise you by being better than you expected. And if you're still here, if you've been listening to this whole thing, then I think you're one of those people too. Someone who looks for the psychology underneath the surface. Someone who knows that a show about 4 kids in Colorado can tell you something real about what it means to be human. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I mean that. These videos take a lot out of me, and knowing someone is on the other end, listening, whether you're falling asleep or wide awake at 3 in the morning, it means more than you know. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. It really does make a difference for a channel this size. And if you can't sleep, well, that's what the next video is for. Good night, everyone. Take care of yourself. And remember what Butters said. Take the bad with the good, the beautiful sadness. I think that might be the best advice anyone in South Park has ever given. And actually, before I really close this out, I realize there are a few more characters and psychological threads I haven't covered that deserve their own space. So if you're still with me, let's keep going. If you're falling asleep, that's okay too. I'll be here when you wake up. I need to talk about Kenny Dies in more detail because it's one of the most psychologically revealing episodes in the entire series, and it tells us something crucial about every one of the four boys. This is Season 5, Episode 13, aired December 5th, 2001, and it's the episode where Kenny's death is, for the first time, taken completely seriously. In every other episode up to this point, Kenny's deaths are a running gag. He gets crushed, he explodes, he gets eaten, and the boys say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny, you bastards," and move on. But in Kenny Dies, Kenny is diagnosed with a terminal muscular disease. He's not blown up. He's not eaten by a bear. He's dying slowly in a hospital bed, the way real people die. And the difference in how the boys respond is staggering. Kyle visits Kenny. He sits by his bed. He shows him a drawing that Butters made of the four boys together on a rocket ship. He's there. He's present. He's scared, but he shows up. That's Kyle's psychology in miniature. When there's something morally clear to do, when the path is obvious, Kyle will walk it. He doesn't always do the right thing, as we've discussed, but when the stakes are unambiguous, he's reliable. Cartman, meanwhile, seems to have a genuine emotional breakdown. He cries in Kyle's arm. He goes before Congress and gives a speech about wanting to save his best friend through stem cell research. He sings a rendition of Heat of the Moment by Asia that actually convinces legislators to lift the ban on stem cells. And for a few moments, you think maybe Cartman actually cared. Maybe underneath all that cruelty and narcissism, there's a kid who loves his friend and doesn't want to lose him. And then the reveal. Cartman didn't want stem cells to save Kenny. He wanted them to clone a Shakey's Pizza restaurant. Kenny's death, Kenny's actual, real, painful death, was nothing more than a marketing opportunity. And Kyle, who, remember, we just watched accept Cartman's tears as genuine, beats the hell out of him. That scene is devastating because of what it tells us about Cartman's capacity for emotional simulation. He can cry, he can perform grief, he can make you believe he cared, and it's all calculated. Every single tear serves a purpose. And that's the hallmark of what psychologists describe as high-functioning antisocial behavior, the ability to mimic emotions you don't actually feel in order to manipulate people who do feel them. Cartman doesn't just lack empathy, he understands empathy well enough to weaponize it, and that's much scarier. But here's the character detail that really gets me in this episode, and I've rewatched it multiple times, trying to articulate why. It's Stan. Stan can't visit Kenny. He physically cannot bring himself to go to the hospital. He can't look at his dying friend. And everyone, Kyle, Chef, his parents, tells him he needs to go. And he keeps saying he will, and he keeps not going. And then Chef has a conversation with Stan about death. And Chef explains that God takes the people closest to it because their tears give him power, which is absurd and dark and very South Park. But underneath that, what Chef is really telling Stan is, it's okay to be afraid. Death is terrifying. Your fear doesn't make you a bad friend. And Stan finally summons the courage to go to the hospital. He walks into Kenny's room, and it's empty. Kenny is dead. His last words, according to Kyle, were, "Where's Stan?" I've been watching South Park for a long time, and that might be the single most heartbreaking moment in the entire series, because it's not played for shock or comedy. There's no punchline. Stan stands in that empty room, looking at the abandoned teddy bear on the floor, and he realizes that his fear cost him the chance to say goodbye to his friend, and he'll carry that forever. And again, this connects to Stan's broader psychology, his tendency toward avoidance, the same avoidance that makes him withdraw during his breakup with Wendy, the same avoidance that makes him turn to alcohol when the world looks like crap. Stan doesn't confront, he retreats, and sometimes the thing you're retreating from doesn't wait for you to be ready. Parker and Stone have said in DVD commentary that they originally planned to kill off Kyle rather than Kenny, but they chose Kenny because they'd grown tired of having to find new ways to kill him each week. And honestly, that creative exhaustion is itself psychologically interesting because it mirrors what the characters feel. Kenny's deaths had become routine. Nobody cared anymore. Even the writers were bored by them. And so they made one death that mattered. And in doing so, they revealed how much the routine had been numbing everyone. The characters, the audience, and even the creator. I keep circling back to this idea of numbness because I think numbness might be the central psychological concept of South Park. Every character, in their own way, is numb to something they shouldn't be numb to. The boys are numb to Kenny's death. The adults are numb to the dysfunction around them. Cartman is numb to the suffering he causes. Stan becomes literally, clinically numb when he turns 10 and everything looks like crap. And the show's most powerful moments are always the ones where the numbness breaks, where someone actually feels something real, and the weight of it is almost unbearable. That's why Kenny dies work. That's why Raisins work. That's why You're Getting Old work. Those are the episodes where the numbness cracks open and the feelings come flooding in and nobody knows what to do with them. All right, let me get into some more characters, because I genuinely feel like every person in this town has something psychologically going on that's worth examining. Let's talk about Sheila Broflovsky for a minute. Kyle's mom, the one Cartman wrote a whole song about, the one who literally starts a war with Canada in the 1999 movie South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. Sheila is fascinating because she represents a specific type of person that we all know, the crusader. The person who wraps their need for control in the language of protecting children. The person who believes so deeply that they're doing the right thing that they become the most destructive force in the room. Sheila's pattern is always the same. She hears about something offensive or dangerous. She launches a campaign to destroy it. The campaign goes too far. Terrible things happen, and Sheila never, ever takes responsibility. In the movie, she executes Terrence and Philip, triggers a war, and nearly brings about the apocalypse, all because she didn't want her son watching a TV show with profanity. And the movie doesn't present her as a villain exactly. It presents her as a parent whose love for her child has metastasized into something destructive because she has no mechanism for managing her own anxiety. And Kyle inherited that. I mentioned earlier that Kyle's moral outrage often mirrors his mother. That's not an accident. The show is making a deliberate point about how psychological patterns are transmitted generationally. Kyle watches his mother launch crusade after crusade, and he learns that righteousness is power. He learns that if you feel strongly enough about something, your feelings override everyone else's, and he fights against that pattern. He's more self-aware than Sheila, but it's in his DNA. When Kyle gets angry about injustice, part of him is channeling Sheila, and part of him knows it. Gerald Broflovsky is an interesting contrast. Kyle's dad is a lawyer, and in the earlier seasons, he's presented as the more reasonable parent. He gives Kyle actual moral lessons. He's calm, where Sheila is explosive. But then, season 20 happens, and Gerald is revealed to be an internet troll, Skankhunt42, who spends his nights anonymously posting vile things online and laughing about it. And the show treats this as a genuine psychological revelation. Gerald, the reasonable man, the lawyer, the father, has this secret life where he's cruel and thoughtless and gets pleasure from other people's pain. And that's the show saying the distinction between good people and bad people is not as clean as we want it to be. Anyone is capable of cruelty when the consequences are invisible. That's actually a huge psychological theme in the troll arc of season 20, the way anonymity changes behavior. When Gerald trolls, he's not Gerald. He's Skankhunt42. The distance between his real identity and his online identity allows him to do things he would never do face to face. And the show extrapolates this into a massive plot about Troll Trade, a Danish website that links people's internet history to their real identities. And the entire town panics because everybody has something they've said or done online that they wouldn't want attached to their name. That's a legitimate psychological insight about the internet age, that the gap between our public selves and our private selves has never been wider, and the anxiety about that gap being closed is enormous. South Park was making this argument in 2016, and it feels even more relevant now. Speaking of adult characters with complicated psychology, I want to touch on a few more before we really wrap up. Stuart and Carol McCormick, Kenny's parent. They're alcoholics who live in poverty and fight constantly. The show mostly plays their dysfunction for background comedy. Stuart throwing things, Carol screaming, their house falling apart. But there are moments where the show lets us see the consequences. Kenny watching his parents fight with a bored, dead-eyed expression. Karen McCormick, Kenny's little sister, looking terrified. The implication that Kenny's older brother Kevin is already on the same path. And here's what I think is subtle and important about how the show handles the McCormick family. It never entirely villainizes them. Stuart and Carol are terrible parents, but they're also genuinely poor. They're dealing with addiction, with unemployment, with a cycle of poverty that they probably inherited from their own parent. And the show, in its own way, acknowledges that context matters. Cartman mocks Kenny for being poor, because Cartman is cruel, but the show itself doesn't mock the McCormick's poverty. It shows the consequences of it. Kenny's clothes, Kenny's muffled voice, because his parka is probably the only warm thing he owns. The fact that they eat Pop-Tarts for dinner because they can't afford anything else, without reducing them to punchline, most of the time. And that connects to something broader about South Park's psychology that I think gets lost in conversations about the show's offensiveness. South Park is mean, it's crude, it attacks everyone, but it's not nihilistic. It has a moral framework, and that moral framework is essentially this: hypocrisy is the worst sin, not cruelty, not vulgarity, not even prejudice. Hypocrisy. The people who get the hardest treatment on South Park are always the people who pretend to be something they're not. The people who preach one thing and practice another. The people who use morality as a weapon. That's why Cartman, who is openly terrible, is treated more sympathetically than characters like Sheila Broflovsky or Rob Reiner or Al Gore in the show. Those characters pretend to be good while doing bad things. Cartman at least is honest about what he is. He doesn't hide behind morality. He doesn't need to, because he doesn't care about morality in the first place. And in the psychology of South Park, being openly monstrous is weirdly less offensive than being secretly monstrous and publicly virtuous. Okay, let me talk about a few more things that I think are essential to understanding the psychological depth of this show. The Imagination Saga, Imagination Land, Parts 1 through 3, Season 11, Episodes 10 through 12, airing October and November 2007, is one of my favorite South Park storylines, and I think it's underappreciated for what it's doing psychologically. The basic premise is that imagination is real, that all fictional characters exist in a shared imaginary realm, and that when terrorists attack Imagination Land, the government gets involved. But the psychological core of the trilogy is the bet between Cartman and Kyle. Cartman bets Kyle that leprechauns are real. If Cartman wins, Kyle has to, and I'm going to be delicate here, perform a specific act on Cartman. And when it turns out that leprechauns do exist in Imagination Land, Cartman spends the entire trilogy trying to enforce the bet. He goes before the Supreme Court. He produces documents. He is relentless. And here's what I find fascinating. The bet is the most important thing in the world to Cartman. Not the terrorist attack, not the destruction of imagination, not the fate of every fictional character ever created. The bet. Because the bet is about power over Kyle. It's about forcing Kyle to submit. And for Cartman, that's worth more than anything else that's happening. The Pentagon could be deploying nuclear weapons into Imagination Land, and Cartman would still be filing legal briefs about his bet. That's narcissism in its purest form. The inability to perceive that anything outside yourself matters. Everything, every event, every crisis, every relationship is filtered through the question, how does this affect me? And if it doesn't affect Cartman directly, it doesn't exist. Meanwhile, Butters, sweet, naive, terrified Butters, ends up being the hero of Imagination Land. He's the one who has to imagine hard enough to bring all the good characters back after the evil ones take over. And he does it because Butters, unlike Cartman, has an imagination that's fundamentally oriented toward good. He can imagine wonderful things because he is, at his core, a wonderful person. And the show is making a point. The quality of your imagination reflects the quality of your character. Cartman's fantasies are about domination and revenge. Butters' fantasies are about hope and connection. And when the chips are down, it's Butters' imagination, not Cartman's cunning, that saves everything. There's a reading of South Park that I find really compelling, and it's this. The show is fundamentally about the battle between cynicism and sincerity. Every episode, in some way, is about that tension. Cartman represents pure cynicism, the belief that nothing matters except self-interest. Butters represents pure sincerity, the belief that everything matters and everyone deserves kindness. And the other characters fall somewhere on that spectrum. Kyle leans towards sincerity, but is contaminated by self-righteousness. Stan leans towards sincerity, but is undermined by depression. Kenny leans towards sincerity, but is trapped by circumstances. Randy has abandoned sincerity entirely in favor of chasing whatever makes him feel alive this week. And the show's thesis, I think, is that sincerity is better than cynicism, but it's also harder and more dangerous. Butters' sincerity gets him hurt over and over again. Kyle's attempts at sincerity are compromised by his ego. Stan's sincerity collapses under the weight of seeing the world too clearly. The only character who never suffers for his worldview is Cartman, because cynicism is armor. If you don't care about anything, nothing can hurt you. But the show also makes clear that Cartman, despite his protection, is the most miserable character in the show. He just doesn't know it. His armor is so complete that he can't feel the emptiness underneath it. I actually have a theory about the four boys that I've never heard anyone else articulate, and it goes like this. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny represent four fundamental responses to the same existential problem, the problem of suffering. How do you deal with the fact that life contains unavoidable pain? Stan's response is despair. He feels the pain, can't handle it, and withdraws. Kyle's response is action. He tries to fix the source of pain, to right the wrong, to make the world better. Cartman's response is denial. He refuses to acknowledge pain as real, or converts it into anger, or inflicts it on others before it can reach him. Kenny's response is endurance. He bears the pain, dies from it, comes back, and bears it again, over and over. And each response has cost. Despair leads to alcoholism and depression. Action leads to self-righteousness and exhaustion. Denial leads to sociopathy and loneliness. Endurance leads to invisibility and isolation. And Butters? Butters represents a fifth possibility that the show spent years developing. Acceptance. Not passive acceptance, not resignation, but active conscious choice to acknowledge the pain and love life anyway. The beautiful sadness. And maybe that's why the show keeps giving Butters more and more prominent. Because of the 5 options, his is the only one that doesn't destroy you. I mean, look at the post-COVID special. In the future timeline, adult Stan is an alcoholic whiskey connoisseur. Adult Kyle is a lonely idealist living in his mother's basement. Adult Cartman is, and this is either the show's cruelest joke or its most profound insight, a loving husband and father who has apparently found genuine happiness through Christianity. And Adult Butters, well, Adult Butters is insane. He's Victor Chaos. He's been locked in a room for 16 years. The one character whose philosophy should have protected him was destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. And that's the show saying, even the best psychological strategy can fail if the environment is toxic enough. Butters' philosophy only works if you have enough support to maintain it. And without that support, without a single person who treats you with basic decency, even beautiful sadness becomes just trauma. That is dark. Even for South Park, that is really dark. And it's one of the reasons I think the post-COVID specials are some of the most psychologically interesting things the show has ever done. Because they take the question, what happens to these kids when they grow up, and answer it honestly. And the answer is, they become versions of what they always were, but magnified by decades of unaddressed damage. Now, I want to talk about something that I think connects to the show's overall psychology in a way that doesn't get discussed enough. The relationship between Trey Parker and Matt Stone and their character. Because I think you can't fully understand the psychology of South Park without understanding the psychology of the people who make it. Parker has talked openly about his struggles with anxiety and his fear of failure. In 6 Days to Air, the 2011 documentary about the show's production process, you can see him agonizing over every creative decision, convinced that each episode is going to be the one that ruins the show. Stone is more laid back, but has discussed feeling trapped by the show's schedule and the relentless pace of production. Together, they've been making South Park for most of their adult lives. They started in their 20s, they're in their 50s now, and the show has grown and changed with them. In the early seasons, the show is primarily about the boys' perspective. The world is confusing and the adults are idiots, but there's a sense of wonder and adventure. That's Parker and Stone in their 20s, young, irreverent, looking at the adult world with a mixture of contempt and fascination. In the middle seasons, roughly 8 through 16, the show shifts to focus more on the adult, especially Randy. The boys are still there, but the stories increasingly revolve around adult anxiety, work, marriage, social status, political correctness. That's Parker and Stone in their 30s and early 40s, realizing that they've become the adults they used to mock, and finding comedy and horror in that realization. In the later seasons, from 17 onward, the show becomes increasingly serialized, more focused on continuity, and more interested in systemic problems. Internet culture, streaming wars, the pandemic, the erosion of community. That's Parker and Stone in their late 40s and 50s, looking at a world that's changed in ways they didn't expect, and trying to make sense of it. And the psychology of the characters has evolved in tandem. Early Cartman is a bratty kid. Later Cartman is a genuine sociopath. That's the show's creators' understanding, more deeply with each passing year, what unchecked narcissism really looks like. Early Stan is a normal kid dealing with normal problems. Later Stan is a depressive alcoholic. That's Parker projecting his own anxieties onto his closest character avatar. Early Randy is a background dad. Later Randy is a midlife crisis in human form. That's Parker and Stone, who have both said they find themselves relating more to Randy as they age, watching themselves become the kind of man they used to ridicule. I think that's part of why South Park endures. It's not just satire, it's autobiography. Parker and Stone are writing about themselves, whether they admit it or not. And because they're growing and changing and aging in real time, so do their characters. There's no writer's room Bible that says, Cartman is this, or Stan feels that. The characters are alive, they're responsive to the world, and to the people creating them, and that gives them a psychological authenticity that no amount of plotting could replicate. Let me cover a few more things, and then I really will bring this home. Timmy and Jimmy deserve a mention, because they represent something important about the show's approach to disability. Timmy, who can only say his own name and a few other phrases, could easily be a cruel joke, and in some episodes, he is. But in others, particularly Timmy 2000 and the Coon and Friends saga, Timmy is given genuine agency and heroism. He's in a band. He's a superhero. He has friends who treat him as an equal. And the show's argument seems to be that the funniest, most respectful thing you can do with a disabled character is treat them exactly like every other character on the show, which means they're funny, they're flawed, they're sometimes heroic, and they're never defined solely by their disability. Jimmy is similar, but more developed. His ambition to be a comedian, his genuine talent, his use of performance-enhancing drugs in Up the Down Steroid, Season 8, Episode 3. All of these are stories about a character who happens to be disabled, not stories about disability itself. And Jimmy's relationship with Timmy, which oscillates between friendship and rivalry, is one of the show's most underrated dynamics. Craig Tucker is another character whose psychology has quietly become one of the most interesting in the show. Craig's whole thing, especially in the early seasons, is that he doesn't care about anything. He flips people off. He's deadpan. He refuses to get drawn into the boys' adventures, and the show uses him as a meta-commentary on itself. In Pandemic, Craig literally tells the camera that he didn't want any part of this adventure, and he just wants to go home. But then, as I mentioned earlier, Craig gets paired with Tweek, and something changes. Craig's emotional flatness, which seemed like a character limitation, becomes a character asset. He's the stable, grounding presence that Tweek desperately needs, and his willingness to be vulnerable with Tweek, to actually show emotion, becomes one of the most genuinely sweet things on the show. Craig didn't stop being deadpan. He just found someone worth being alive for. And I think about that in the context of the show's broader psychology. The idea that the right relationship can unlock parts of you that you didn't know existed. Craig without Tweek is just a cynical kid with a middle finger. Craig with Tweek is a person, and the show doesn't make a big deal out of it. It just lets it happen, which, in a show known for making a big deal out of everything, is itself a kind of statement. All right, one more character, and then I'm really wrapping up. Wendy Testaberger. Wendy is, in my opinion, the most underused character on the show, and every time she gets focused, she proves why she deserves more. In Breast Cancer Show Ever, Season 12, Episode 9, aired October 15th, 2008. Wendy tries to give a presentation about breast cancer, and Cartman disrupts it by making jokes about breasts. Wendy challenges him to a fight. Cartman spends the entire episode trying to weasel out of it because, deep down, he knows she'll beat him, and she does. She beats the hell out of him in front of the whole school. And it's incredibly satisfying, not just because Cartman gets what he deserves, but because it's one of the few times the show lets a female character be genuinely powerful without qualification or comedy undermining it. Wendy's psychology is about integrity. She's principled in a way that Kyle aspires to be, but often isn't. She follows through. When she says she's going to do something, she does it. And her frustration with Stan, her on-again, off-again boyfriend throughout the series, is the frustration of a strong person who keeps gravitating towards someone who doesn't match her energy. Stan is passive. Wendy is active. Stan avoids. Wendy confronts. And their relationship keeps cycling because, on some level, Wendy believes Stan can be what she needs him to be, and Stan keeps proving that he can't. There's a gender dynamic in South Park that doesn't get talked about enough. The female characters, Wendy, Bebe, Heidi, the Raisins girls, Sheila Broflovsky, are generally more competent, more emotionally aware, and more willing to take action than the male characters. But the show is still, fundamentally, from the boys' perspective. And so the female characters often exist in relation to the boys, rather than as fully independent agents. The show has gotten better about this over time. Wendy's confrontation with Cartman, Heidi's arc with Cartman, even Shelley Marsh's occasional moments of depth, but it's still a limitation. And I think the show knows it's a limitation, which is why it occasionally foregrounds female characters and lets them be complicated. Okay, for real this time. Let's bring it all home. I started this video with Cartman licking tears off of Scott Tenorman's face, and I want to end with a different image. It's from Raisin. It's Butters standing in the rain. His hair is wet, his eyes are red from crying, and a girl he loved, or thought he loved, has just told him he means nothing to her. And the goth kids are standing there, ready to welcome him into the darkness, ready to tell him that the world is pain and meaning is a lie, and the only honest response to existence is despair. And Butters says no. He says the sadness is beautiful. He says he'd rather feel pain than feel nothing. He says he'd rather be a crying little kid than someone who's given up on caring. And I think about that speech a lot, not just in the context of South Park, but in the context of my own life, and maybe yours too, because we all get offered the chance to go dark. We all have moments where the easiest thing to do would be to stop caring, to become cynical, to put on the armor and never let anything in again. And some of us take that deal. Some of us become Stan, numbing out with whatever substance or behavior makes the world stop looking so terrible. Some of us become Cartman, deciding that if the world is going to be cruel, we might as well be the cruelest thing in it. Some of us become Kyle, wrapping ourselves in moral certainty and hoping nobody notices the hypocrisy underneath. But some of us try to be Butters. We try to stay open, to keep feeling, to take the hits and still show up the next day with a smile on our face. Not because we're naive or stupid, but because we've made a conscious decision that the alternative is worse. That going dark, as tempting as it is, costs too much. That the beautiful sadness, as painful as it is proof that we're alive. I've been making these videos for a while now, and every time I do one of these deep dives, I learn something new about a show I thought I already understood. And what I've learned tonight, sitting with the psychology of every character in South Park, is this: the show is not nihilistic. I've heard people call it that for years, and I always pushed back, but I never could articulate exactly why I disagreed. Now I can. South Park is not nihilistic, because it believes in the reality of suffering. It believes that pain matters. It believes that how you respond to pain defines who you are. And it believes, quietly, reluctantly, under layers and layers of profanity and satire, that choosing to care is better than choosing not to, even when caring hurts, especially when caring hurts. That's the psychology of South Park. That's the thing underneath all the construction paper, and the fart jokes, and the dead Kennies, and the Cartman scheme. A show that understands, deeply, genuinely understand what it means to be a flawed person trying to navigate a flawed world, and that the best any of us can do is choose the beautiful sadness over the comfortable numbness. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring enough about this weird, brilliant, offensive, tender, impossible show to spend this many hours with me going through it. I don't take that for granted. Every single person who watches these videos, who subscribes, who leaves a comment, who shares it with a friend, you're the reason I keep doing this, and I mean that. If you want more of this, subscribe, hit that notification bell, leave a comment telling me which character's psychology you think I should explore further. There's so much more to talk about. I barely scratched the surface on characters like Craig, Tweak, Jimmy, Timmy, Clyde, Scott Malkinson, PC Principal, Strong Woman, and dozens of others. Every character in this town has a story, and every story has a psychology. And I want to keep exploring all of them with you. And if you're listening to this as you fall asleep, which I know a lot of you are, and I think that's genuinely cool, that these videos are part of your nighttime routine, then I hope you sleep well. I hope you dream about something that makes you happy. And I hope you wake up tomorrow and, like Butters, choose to love life, even the sad part, especially the sad part. Good night, South Park. Good night, everyone. Actually, you know what? I'm not done. I thought I was done, but there's too much left on the table. So let's keep going. I haven't even talked about some of the most psychologically interesting episodes in the entire series, and there are whole character dynamics I've barely touched. So settle back in. Let's do this properly. I want to go back to Cartman for a second, because there's a dimension of his psychology that I glossed over earlier, and it's one that I think makes him genuinely unique in television history, and that's his relationship with his mother. Leanne Cartman is, on the surface, one of the nicest characters in South Park. She's sweet. She's accommodating. She calls Cartman Poopsikin. She makes him whatever he wants for dinner. She never raises her voice. And she is, without question, one of the most psychologically damaging parents in fiction. Because Leanne's niceness isn't kindness, it's abdication. She has completely surrendered the role of parent. She gives Cartman everything he wants, not because she loves him so much that she can't bear to see him unhappy, but because she's too weak, too needy, too desperate for his approval to say no. And the show makes this explicit. In Tist, Season 10, Episode 7, which aired May 3rd, 2006, Leanne hires Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer, to help control Cartman after a series of nannies fail. And Millan's approach works. He treats Cartman the way he treats misbehaving dog, with calm, firm authority. And Cartman, for the first time in the series, starts behaving. He's polite, he's helpful, he's normal. And it's bizarre to watch because you realize that all Cartman ever needed was a boundary. A single, consistent, boundary. But then Leanne undermines it. She can't maintain the discipline. She needs Cartman to love her more than she needs him to be a functional human being. And by the end of the episode, everything reverts. Cartman is back to being Cartman. And the show is making a devastating point about parenting, that it's not enough to know what's right. You have to be strong enough to do it consistently. And Leanne isn't strong enough. She never has been. And so Cartman continues to be Cartman, and it's her fault as much as it is his. There's a psychological concept called enmeshment, where the boundaries between parent and child become so blurred that the parent's emotional needs and the child's become indistinguishable. Leanne and Cartman have an enmeshed relationship. She needs his affection. He needs her compliance. Neither can function without the other, and both are made worse by the arrangement. Cartman becomes a tyrant because there's nobody to stop him. Leanne becomes a doormat because she's terrified of losing the only person who gives her life meaning. And here's the tragic thing. In South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, the 1999 movie, Leanne is revealed to be a hermaphrodite who is actually Cartman's father. That revelation was later retconned in 201, where we learn that Jack Tennerman was the real father. But both revelations point to the same psychological truth. Cartman's identity is built on lies. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know where he comes from. And his mother has been lying to him his entire life. Every tantrum, every scheme, every act of cruelty can be traced back to a child whose foundation is made of sand. I think about that a lot, because it doesn't excuse Cartman. Nothing excuses Cartman, but it does explain him. And the show's willingness to provide explanations without excuses is, I think, one of the most psychologically mature things about it. Let me pivot now to something I've been wanting to discuss since the beginning of this video, and that's the way South Park handles the concept of identity. Because identity, who you are, who you're allowed to be, who the world tells you to be, is one of the show's most consistent themes, and it explores it through almost every character. We already talked about Garrison's identity crisis, the sex changes, the political transformation, the relationship with Mr. Hat. But identity is also at the heart of Kyle's struggle with his Judaism, of Kenny's invisibility, of Butter's inability to be who he actually is because his parents have decided who he should be, of Randy's desperate reinvention, of Stan's complete loss of self when depression hit. And then there are the episodes that tackle identity head on. The Sissy, Season 18, Episode 3, which aired October 8th, 2014, is about Cartman claiming to be transgender so he can use the girls' bathroom. And the show uses this absurd premise to explore something real about how institutions handle identity claim. Because Cartman is obviously lying. He's not transgender. He just wants a nicer bathroom. But the school can't say that without getting in trouble. So they create a separate bathroom, and then Randy, who's secretly performing as Lord, starts using it too. And the episode becomes a surprisingly nuanced exploration of the difference between identity as lived experience and identity as performance. The show gets in trouble for these episodes sometimes, and I understand why. But I think what South Park is usually doing when it tackles identity is asking a legitimate psychological question. Where does authentic identity end and social performance begin? And is there even a clear line? Because every identity is, to some degree, performed. We all choose what to show the world and what to hide. The question South Park keeps asking is, at what point does the performance become the reality? And at what point does questioning someone's performance become an act of cruelty? Those are real psychological questions. They don't have easy answers. And to the show's credit, it usually doesn't pretend they do. It raises the question, explores them through absurdity, and lets the audience sit with the discomfort. I want to go back to the kids for a moment and talk about something I've been noticing across multiple rewatches, the way the show depicts the deterioration of childhood innocence, because I think that's one of the most consistent psychological themes in the entire series. In the earliest episodes, the boys are kids, full stop. They play game, they watch TV, they get confused by adult things, they have a sense of wonder, and gradually, over the course of 28 seasons, that wonder erodes. Not completely. The show still has moments of childhood joy, but significantly. By the time you get to season 20 and beyond, the boys are weary. They're tired of the adults' nonsense. They're tired of the world's nonsense. They've seen too much. And the show charts that erosion with incredible precision. Take Butters. In the early seasons, Butters is pure. He's innocent to the point of absurdity. He doesn't understand sexual references. He takes everything at face value. He believes in the fundamental goodness of people. By the later seasons, Butters is still kind, but he's not innocent anymore. He's been used by Cartman too many times. He's been grounded too many times. He's seen too much. And the show mourns that loss, even as it participates in causing it. Or take Kenny. In the early seasons, Kenny's deaths are funny. They're over the top. they're consequence-free. By the Mysterian arc in season 14, Kenny's deaths have become a source of existential anguish. The show took a gag and turned it into a tragedy. And that shift from comedy to tragedy mirrors the loss of innocence. When you're young, bad things are abstract and temporary. When you grow up, you realize they're real and permanent. Kenny's arc is the show's way of acknowledging that growing up means learning that death is not a punchline. And I know I keep coming back to "you're getting old," but it's so central to this theme that I can't avoid it. Stan turning 10 and seeing everything as crap is the show's most explicit statement about the loss of childhood wonder. It's not that the world gets worse, it's that you start seeing it more clearly. And clarity, it turns out, is depressing. Trey Parker has talked about this in interviews. The feeling that as you get older, the things that used to excite you stop working. Music sounds the same. Movies feel predictable. Even the show you've been making for 15 years starts to feel like a chore. And instead of processing that feeling in a healthy way, Parker channeled it into an episode where a 10-year-old boy literally sees and hears everything as excrement, which is both hilarious and devastatingly honest. Let me talk about one more thematic thread, and then I'll truly wrap up. The thread is what South Park says about community. South Park. The town is a terrible community. The adults are easily manipulated. They form mobs at the slightest provocation. They turn on each other regularly. They ignore genuine problems while panicking about imaginary ones. They let children fend for themselves. They fail consistently and spectacularly at every aspect of communal living. And yet, the town keeps existing. The people keep living there. The kids keep going to school. Life goes on. And I think the show is saying something about community that's actually kind of profound. That community isn't about being good. It's about being stuck together. It's about the fact that whether you like it or not, these are your neighbors. This is your school. This is your town. And you have to figure out how to coexist with the dumbest, most annoying, most destructive people imaginable. Because the alternative, isolation, withdrawal, leaving, is worse. Stan tried to leave. In You're Getting Old, he was effectively separated from the community. He was alone, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Kyle has threatened to leave multiple times. He never does. Even Cartman, who claims to hate everyone, needs the town. He needs an audience. He needs people to be outraged by his behavior. Without the community, Cartman is just a fat kid alone in his room, talking to his stuffed animal. And I think that's actually one of the most psychologically honest things about the show. That we need other people, even when other people are terrible. That isolation, as appealing as it sounds when you're angry or hurt or exhausted, is a kind of death. And that the messy, frustrating, infuriating process of living in community with other flawed human beings is, in the end, the thing that keeps us human. That's what the bus stop scenes are about, when you think about it. 4 kids standing at a bus stop, waiting for a bus that will take them to a school run by idiots in a town full of lunatics. And they stand there together every morning because they have to. Because where else would they go? There's something about that image, the 4 of them, standing in the snow, waiting, that captures the entire show. It's not glamorous. It's not exciting. It's just light, showing up, being present, standing next to people who drive you crazy, because the alternative is standing alone. And maybe that's the most psychologically healthy thing South Park has ever depicted. Not a grand insight, not a clever analysis, just the simple act of showing up, of being there, of not going dark. There's a moment in the show, and I can't pinpoint the exact episode, but it happens multiple times, where the boys are walking home after some insane adventure, an alien invasion, or a zombie outbreak, or a battle between gods and devil, and they're just walking, like normal kids, like nothing happened. And one of them will say something completely mundane, like asking if the other one wants to play video game, and that's it. That's the whole scene. And I think those moments are the show at its most psychologically true, because that's how people actually process extreme experiences, not through dramatic speeches or therapeutic breakthrough, through the mundane, through routine, through the act of putting one foot in front of the other and doing the normal thing, even when the normal thing feels absurd in the context of what just happened. That's what South Park understands about psychology better than any other show I've watched. That the big dramatic insights are rare. That most of life is the small stuff. The bus stops, and the video games, and the walking home. And that the way you handle the small stuff is, in the end, more important than how you handle the crises, because the crises end. The small stuff never does. Stan handles the small stuff by going along. Kyle handles it by arguing. Cartman handles it by scheming. Kenny handles it by being present. Butters handles it by being grateful. And the town of South Park handles it by being South Park, by being stupid and panicky and cruel and hypocritical and occasionally, unexpectedly beautiful. That's the psychology of every South Park character, not the diagnoses or the personality types or the clinical terminology, just the small, daily, human act of showing up to a world that doesn't make sense and trying, however badly, to make it through the day. And that's enough. That's always been enough. Trey Parker and Matt Stone figured that out 28 years ago, and they've been telling us ever since. We just had to listen. Okay, now I'm really done. For real this time. I promise. Thank you. Seriously, thank you for this. For staying. For listening. For caring about construction paper kids and their messed up town and all the beautiful, terrible, hilarious, heartbreaking things that happen there. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who loves South Park. Leave a comment. Come back for the next one. And remember, beautiful sadness. Always beautiful sadness. Good night. Okay, I lied. I'm not done. I keep thinking of things I didn't cover, and they're nagging at me. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go through a few more characters, a few more episodes, and a few more psychological concepts that I think are essential to really understanding this show. And then I'll stop. I promise. Probably. Let me talk about something that I think is one of the most psychologically rich episodes in the entire series, and it doesn't get brought up enough in these kinds of conversations. Kasa Bonita, Season 7, Episode 11, aired November 12, 2003. On the surface, it's a simple story. Kyle is having his birthday party at Kasa Bonita, a real restaurant in Denver that Trey Parker and Matt Stone actually loved as kids. Kyle invites everyone except Cartman, because Cartman is terrible. And Cartman, desperate to go, manipulates the situation by convincing Butters that a meteor is about to destroy the Earth, locking Butters in a bomb shelter for days so that Cartman can take his spot at the party. And look, the comedy of this episode is incredible. Cartman leading Butters through an apocalyptic wasteland that he's staged with ketchup and props. Butters believing every word of it because he's Butters, and he trusts people because that's who he is. Cartman eating the sopapillas at Kasa Bonita with this look of pure, transcendent joy on his face. It's one of the funniest episodes the show has ever made, but the psychology of it is deeply unsettling. Because what Cartman does to Butters in this episode is a textbook example of what psychologists call coercive control. He isolates Butters from everyone who might tell him the truth. He creates a false reality where Cartman is the only source of information. He makes Butters dependent on him for survival. He uses Butters' trust against him. And he does all of it, because he wants to go to a restaurant. That's the terrifying thing about Cartman. His motivations are often trivial. He didn't imprison Butters in a bomb shelter because he hated Butters or wanted to hurt him. He did it because he wanted sopapillas. The cruelty is incidental. The goal is pleasure. And the fact that achieving his pleasure requires the complete psychological manipulation of another human being doesn't register as a problem for him. It's just a step in the process, like buying a ticket or making a reservation. And Butters' psychology in this episode is equally fascinating, because even after he's rescued, even after he learns the truth, you know Butters isn't going to hold it against Cartman. Not really, not permanently, because Butters' psychology doesn't allow for permanent anger. He processes his emotions. He might be sad or hurt for a while, and then he moves on. That's his superpower and his vulnerability. He can't hold a grudge, which means he can't protect himself from people who will inevitably exploit that quality. I think Kasa Bonita is the clearest illustration of the Cartman-Butters dynamic in the entire series. Cartman is the wolf, Butters is the sheep, and the wolf doesn't hate the sheep. The wolf just needs the sheep, needs it to be trusting and compliant and available. And the sheep keeps showing up because being a sheep is all it knows how to be. Let me now talk about an aspect of the show's psychology that I find genuinely groundbreaking, and it's the way South Park depicts addiction. We've already discussed Stan's alcoholism and Randy's various addictions, but the show tackles addiction more broadly and more intelligently than almost any other comedy on television. Medicinal Fried Chicken, Season 14, Episode 3, aired March 31st, 2010, is about Randy giving himself testicular cancer so he can qualify for medical marijuana. And the image of Randy bouncing around town on his enormous testicles is one of the most iconic visual gags in the show's history. But underneath the absurdity, the episode is making a serious point about addiction, that people will literally destroy their body, will inflict pain and damage on themselves in order to access their drug of choice. And the show doesn't judge Randy for this. It just shows the behavior and lets you draw your own conclusion. Major Boobage, Season 12, Episode 3, aired March 26th, 2008, is about the kids getting high by huffing cat urine, which the show calls cheesing. And the highs are depicted as elaborate heavy metal style fantasy sequences. The show eventually reveals that Gerald Broflovsky, Kyle's dad, was a cheese addict when he was young and relapses during the episode. And the way the show handles Gerald's relapse is psychologically smart. It shows how addiction works through triggers, how exposure to a substance you used to abuse can restart the craving, and how the shame of relapse makes it harder to seek help. Freemium Isn't Free, Season 18, Episode 6, aired November 5th, 2014, tackles video game addiction and the psychology of freemium games. Stan becomes addicted to a Terrence and Philip mobile game that's designed to exploit compulsive spending. And the episode actually explains the psychology of these games, the variable reward schedule, the sunk cost fallacy, the exploitation of dopamine loops. Stan's dad, Randy, confronts him about his spending, and Stan points out that Randy is an alcoholic, which is essentially the same thing. And Randy says, no it isn't, because alcohol is different. And then the show cuts to a sequence where Satan himself explains that addiction is addiction, regardless of the substance or behavior. I love that episode because it demonstrates something I've been arguing throughout this video. South Park doesn't just satirize, it educates. It takes complex psychological concepts and presents them in accessible, entertaining ways. The show taught an entire generation about the psychology of freemium games by having Satan deliver a TED Talk about dopamine. That's genius. And addiction is just one of the psychological conditions the show has explored with surprising depth. Let me list a few more. Body dysmorphia. The List, Season 11, Episode 14, explores how being ranked by appearance affects children's self-image. BB's Boobs Destroy Society, Season 6, Episode 10, examines how physical development during puberty creates social hierarchies and distorts behavior. Hoarding. Enmeshment, Season 14, Episode 10, aired October 20th, 2010, uses a parody of Inception to explore Stan's hoarding tendency, diving into layers of his psyche to understand why he can't let go of his possession. It's silly, but the underlying concept that hoarding is about emotional attachment and anxiety about loss is psychologically sound. Eating disorder. Weight Gain 4000, the second episode of the very first season, aired August 20th, 1997, and it's about Cartman gaining massive weight while using a protein supplement. But the show has also explored the pressures around body image in more nuanced ways in later episodes, particularly through female characters' storyline. Conspiracy thinking. Multiple episodes, from Mystery of the Urinal Deuce to Pandemic to the QAnon-themed special, explore why people believe in conspiracy. And the show's answer is consistent and psychologically informed. People believe in conspiracies because the alternative is scarier. It's more comforting to believe that someone is in control, even if that someone is evil, than to accept that nobody is in control, and the world is fundamentally chaotic. PTSD and trauma response. While the show rarely uses clinical language, multiple characters exhibit post-traumatic behavior. Kenny's recklessness after repeated death, Butter's anxiety and compliance after years of abuse, Stan's emotional shutdown. The show doesn't label these conditions, but it depicts them accurately. Social anxiety and isolation. Tweek's entire character is built around anxiety so severe that it's physically debilitating. His parents exacerbate it by feeding him coffee and telling him scary stories. And the show treats his anxiety not as a joke, though it's played for comedy, but as a real condition that affects every aspect of his life. His relationship with Craig works partly because Craig doesn't make Tweek's anxiety worse. He just accepts it and works around it. I could go on. The show has explored jealousy through Cartman's relationship with Kyle, grief through Kenny dies, and the return of Chef, codependency through Leanne and Cartman, through Stan and Wendy, through Randy and Sharon, scapegoating through practically every episode where the town blames one person or group for their collective problem, projection through characters like Sheila Broflovsky and PC Principal, who see in others the flaws they can't acknowledge in themselves. And this is what I mean when I say South Park is secretly one of the most psychologically sophisticated shows on television. It doesn't present itself that way. It presents itself as a vulgar cartoon about kids who say bad words. But the writers, whether they're doing it consciously or not, keep returning to genuine psychological concepts and depicting them with remarkable accuracy. The characterization is consistent. The behaviors are recognizable. The consequences are real. And the emotional truths, buried under layers of toilet humor and shock value, are honest. Let me spend a bit more time on some of the dynamics between characters, because I think the relationships in South Park are where the psychology really shines. The Stan and Kyle friendship is the backbone of the show, and it's modeled directly on the real-life friendship between Trey Parker and Matt Stone. Parker has said that Stan and Kyle are essentially him and Stone. Stan is Parker, the more emotional and anxious one, and Kyle is Stone, the more reactive and principled one. And their friendship, like Parker and Stone's, is built on a foundation of genuine affection that can withstand significant disagreement. But the show has also explored what happens when that friendship is strained. In You're Getting Old and Asperger's, the friendship effectively dissolves. Stan's depression makes him impossible to be around. Kyle replaces him with Cartman, of all people, as a gaming buddy, and the show treats this as devastating. Not because anyone does anything wrong, but because depression is an illness that pushes people away even when they want to stay. Stan doesn't choose to lose Kyle. His brain forces it on him. And Kyle doesn't choose to abandon Stan. He just can't handle watching his best friend disappear. The Cartman and Kyle rivalry is the other central relationship, and it's psychologically fascinating because it's not really a rivalry at all. It's a dependency. Cartman needs Kyle to define himself again. Kyle needs Cartman to feel morally superior to. They're locked in a psychological dance that neither can exit because both derive meaning from it. Take away Cartman, and Kyle doesn't know who he is. He's just a kid with strong opinions and nobody to fight. Take away Kyle, and Cartman doesn't know who he is either. He's just a cruel kid with nobody to be outraged by his cruelty. The show acknowledged this dependency directly in Smug Alert, Season 10, Episode 2, aired March 29th, 2006, where Kyle moves away from South Park and Cartman is devastated. Not because he'll miss Kyle, because without Kyle, his pranks have no audience. His anti-Semitism has no target. His cruelty has no satisfying reaction. Cartman literally goes to San Francisco to bring Kyle back. And when they reunite, they immediately start fighting again, because that's the relationship. The fighting is the relationship. There's a psychodynamic concept called object constancy, the ability to maintain an emotional bond with someone even when they frustrate you. Cartman and Kyle both have object constancy with each other, which is ironic because Cartman arguably doesn't have it with anyone else. He can maintain a relationship with Kyle through decades of mutual hostility because Kyle serves a psychological function that nobody else can serve. And Kyle, for all his moral posturing, maintains a relationship with the most immoral person he knows because fighting Cartman is the thing that makes Kyle feel most like himself. I find that incredibly compelling because it suggests that our most important relationships aren't always our happiest ones. Sometimes the person who brings out the strongest response in you, even a negative response, is the person you need the most. Not because they make you better, but because they make you feel something. And feeling something, as Butters would say, is proof that you're alive. The Cartman and Butters dynamic is different. It's not a rivalry. It's exploitation. Cartman uses Butters the way a bully uses a victim, as a source of power and entertainment. But it's also, in its twisted way, the closest thing Cartman has to a genuine friendship outside of the main four. Cartman goes to Butters when he needs a sidekick, when he needs someone to believe in his scheme, when he needs someone who won't question him. And Butters shows up every time because Butters believes everyone deserves a chance, even Cartman. And there are moments, rare, small, easily missed, where Cartman is actually decent to Butters. Not often, not consistently, but occasionally. A moment where he doesn't exploit Butters' trust. A moment where he seems to actually enjoy Butters' company. And those moments are psychologically important because they suggest that even Cartman's defenses have cracks. Even the most armored person in South Park can, in the right moment, with the right person, let something genuine through. I think that's why Butters is such an effective foil for Cartman, because Butters' sincerity is so relentless, so unconditional, that it occasionally overwhelms Cartman's defenses. Not permanently, not meaningfully, but enough to suggest that the human capacity for connection is, in some fundamental way, unkillable, even in the darkest heart, even in Eric Theodore Cartman. And maybe that's the final psychological insight South Park has to offer. That connection is stronger than cynicism, not because connection always wins. In South Park, it often doesn't. Butters still gets exploited. Stan still gets depressed. Kyle still gets frustrated. Kenny still dies. The town still panics. The adults still fail. Nothing is fixed. Nothing stays fixed. But the impulse to connect, to show up at the bus stop, to visit your friend in the hospital, to choose beautiful sadness over comfortable numbness, that impulse keeps reasserting itself, season after season, episode after episode, through every catastrophe and every reset. That's not optimism. Optimism would be believing things will get better. South Park doesn't believe things will get better. It believes things will keep being the same, flawed and chaotic and painful and absurd. But it also believes that within that sameness, within that eternal cycle of dysfunction, there are moments worth having, friendships worth maintaining, truths worth telling, fights worth fighting, tears worth crying. And I think that's a more honest, more psychologically mature worldview than either pure optimism or pure cynicism. It's the worldview of someone who has seen enough of the world to know that it won't change, but who keeps showing up anyway, because showing up is the only thing that mattered. That's Stan at the bus stop. That's Kyle giving the speech. That's Kenny putting on the cape. That's Butters standing in the rain. That's Randy trying another stupid idea. That's Garrison walking back into the classroom. That's the entire town of South Park, Colorado, waking up every morning in a world that makes no sense and trying, however incompetently, to get through another day. That's the psychology of every South Park character. And honestly, that's the psychology of every person watching this video right now, including me. We show up, we do our best, we fail, we try again, and somewhere in the middle of all that failure, if we're lucky, we find a moment of beautiful sadness that makes the whole thing worthwhile. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Subscribe, share, come back, and good night. For real this time. Good night. Wait. One more thing. I can't believe I almost got through this entire video without giving Cartman Land the attention it deserved. Season 5, Episode 6, aired July 25th, 2001. This is one of the most psychologically important episodes in the entire series, and it's also one of the funniest, because it does something that almost no other episode has done. It puts Kyle's faith, his actual religious faith, on trial. Here's the setup. Cartman inherits $1 million from his grandmother, and instead of doing anything reasonable with it, he buys an entire amusement park, North Park Funland, and renames it Cartman Land. His plan is simple. He will be the only person allowed in. No lines, no other kid, just Cartman, alone, riding every ride whenever he wants. And it works. He's deliriously happy. And Kyle watches this happen, and something breaks in him. Not emotionally, like when Wendy broke up with Stan, theologically. Kyle, the show's most devout Jewish character, the one who wrestles with his faith more honestly than any other character, looks at the universe and asks a question that humans have been asking for thousands of years. How can a just God allow a terrible person to be rewarded? How can Cartman, who has done nothing but cause suffering, inherit a fortune and achieve his dream? Where is the justice? Where is God in this equation? And the stress of this existential crisis gives Kyle an inflamed hemorrhoid, which becomes infected, which nearly kills him. His parents try to comfort him by telling him the story of Job from the Bible, the man who lost everything but kept his faith. But they leave out the ending where Job gets everything back. And Kyle, hearing about a good man who suffered endlessly for no reason other than to settle a cosmic bet between God and Satan, doesn't find comfort. He finds horror. He renounces his faith entirely. I think about this episode a lot because it's tackling something genuinely difficult. The problem of evil, the theodicy question, the oldest and most persistent challenge to religious belief. Why do bad things happen to good people? And the show's answer is fascinating. Kyle doesn't regain his faith because someone gives him a logical argument. He regains his faith because he sees Cartman lose everything. Cartman's park becomes too expensive to maintain. The IRS seizes his money. Kenny's family sues him for wrongful death after Kenny dies on one of the rides. And by the end, Cartman is standing outside his former park, throwing rocks and getting pepper sprayed by his own security guard, screaming in impotent rage. And Kyle, watching this from a wheelchair at the edge of death, recovers instantly. His hemorrhoid shrinks. His faith returns. He looks up and says, "You are up there." And the psychology of that moment is incredible. Because Kyle's faith isn't restored by evidence of God's goodness. It's restored by evidence of Cartman's suffering. Kyle's theology, when you strip away the rhetoric, is essentially this. I believe in God because God eventually punishes people I hate. That's not a mature faith. That's not Job's faith. That's a child's faith. Transactional, self-centered, based on the expectation that the universe will eventually confirm your worldview. And the show knows this. It's not presenting Kyle's recovery as a triumph. It's presenting it as a psychological defense mechanism. Kyle needs to believe the world is just. When the world appears unjust, Cartman getting rewarded, Kyle literally falls apart. When the world appears just again, Cartman getting punished, Kyle instantly recovers. And that tells us something profound about Kyle's psychology and about the psychology of faith more broadly. For Kyle, God isn't a metaphysical reality. God is a coping strategy. God is the thing that makes the universe bearable. And when that strategy fails, when the universe refuses to cooperate, Kyle's entire psychological structure collapses. His body reflects his spiritual state. The hemorrhoid is a physical manifestation of existential dread. That's sophisticated writing. That's genuinely sophisticated psychological and theological writing. And it's happening in an episode where a 9-year-old buys an amusement park and another 9-year-old almost dies from a hemorrhoid. That's the miracle of South Park. the ability to embed genuine insight inside absolute absurdity. And here's the callback I promised. Remember earlier, I talked about how Kyle's morality is often performative, how his righteousness is partly about feeling superior? Cartman Land is the episode that makes that explicit. Kyle doesn't care about abstract justice. He cares about Cartman getting what he deserves. When Cartman prospers, Kyle's entire framework collapses. When Cartman suffers, Kyle's framework is restored. It's not about God. It's about Kyle's need to believe that the universe validates his worldview. And that's a deeply human psychological need. We all have it. We all want to believe that the people who hurt us will eventually be punished, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And when reality contradicts that belief, when a terrible person inherits $1 million and buys a theme park, it shakes us to our core. Kyle's crisis of faith in Cartman Land is really a crisis of meaning. If the universe doesn't reward goodness and punish evil, then what's the point of being good? Why does Kyle bother standing up to Cartman? Why does he give those speeches? Why does he try to do the right thing? If there's no cosmic scorekeeper, then Kyle's moral project is just ego. It's just him wanting to feel good about himself. And that realization, which the episode never makes explicit, but absolutely implies, is terrifying to Kyle. Because if that's true, then Kyle is not fundamentally different from Cartman. He's just playing a different game for the same prize, self-satisfaction. I don't think the show intended that reading explicitly, but I think it's there. And I think it's one of the reasons Cartman Land is considered one of the best episodes of the series. And while we're on the topic of faith and meaning, let me mention All About Mormon, Season 7, Episode 12, aired November 19th, 2003, which is a surprisingly gentle and thoughtful exploration of why people believe in things that are, on the surface, absurd. The episode tells the story of Joseph Smith and the founding of Mormonism, and with every ridiculous revelation, the golden plates, the seer stones, the lost tribes of Israel, a refrain plays, dum 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 dum. It's savage. It's hilarious. And then, at the very end, the Mormon kid, Gary, turns to Stan and says something that completely reframes the episode. He essentially says, yeah, maybe the story is ridiculous, but his family is happy. They treat each other well. They have meaning in their lives. So who cares if the story is dumb? And Stan is speechless, because Gary is right. The value of a belief system isn't in its factual accuracy. It's in its psychological utility. Does it make people treat each other better? Does it give them a sense of purpose? Does it help them cope with the terrifying randomness of existence? If so, then maybe it doesn't matter whether it's true in the empirical sense. That's a remarkably mature position for a show to take, and it connects directly to the psychological themes we've been discussing all night. Because every character in South Park has their own version of Gary's Mormonism, their own story they tell themselves to make life make sense. Kyle's story is about justice. Cartman's story is about power. Stan's story is about, well, Stan hasn't found his story yet. That might be why he's the most lost of all the boys. Let me round this out with a few final observations about the show's collective psychology. South Park is, at its core, a show about a very specific kind of American experience. The experience of living in a small town where nothing much happens, where the same people keep making the same mistake, where change is resisted, and conformity is enforced, and individuality is punished. And the show's psychology reflects that. The characters don't grow in the way characters on prestige dramas grow. They don't have arcs that lead to resolution. They have patterns that repeat. Stan gets depressed, recovers, gets depressed again. Kyle gets outraged, gives a speech, gets outraged again. Cartman schemes, fails, schemes again. Kenny dies, comes back, dies again. Butters gets exploited, gets exploited again. Randy obsesses, moves on, obsesses again. The town panics, calms down, panics again. And I think that repetition is itself a psychological insight, because that's how most people actually live. Not in dramatic arcs with climaxes and denouement. In cycle, we repeat our pattern. We fall into the same traps. We make the same mistakes with different window dressing. And the rare moments of genuine change, the moments where someone actually breaks the cycle and becomes something different, those moments are rare, precisely because they're hard, almost impossibly hard. South Park has had those moments. Butter's speech in Raisin, Kenny's sacrifice in Coon vs. Coon and Friends, Stan's breakdown in You're Getting Old, Cartman's brief, terrifying moments of vulnerability. Those are the moments where the cycle pauses, where the character glimpses something beyond their pattern, where genuine growth is possible. But the show is honest about the fact that those moments usually don't last. The cycle resumes, the pattern reasserts itself, and the characters go back to being who they've always been. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to break the cycle. Maybe the point is to have those moments at all, to feel something real, even if it doesn't last, to glimpse a different way of being, even if you can't sustain it. To stand in the rain after a heartbreak and say, I'm sad, but at the same time, I'm really happy that something could make me feel that sad. That's the psychology of South Park. That's what 28 seasons and over 300 episodes have been building toward. Not a resolution, not a lesson, not a cure, just a moment. A moment of beautiful sadness in an ugly, chaotic, hilarious, heartbreaking world. And that moment is enough. It's always been enough. Thank you for listening. Good night. And I mean it this time. Good night. Okay, I know I keep saying I'm done. And at this point, you probably don't believe me anymore. And honestly, that's fair. But there are a few more things that I think genuinely need to be covered if we're going to call this a complete psychological breakdown of the show. So bear with me, or fall asleep. Either way, I'm going to keep talking. I haven't said nearly enough about the psychology of Sharon Marsh, and I think she's one of the most interesting adult characters on the show, precisely because she's the one who sees everything most clearly and is the least equipped to do anything about it. Sharon is the only adult in South Park who consistently recognizes when things have gone too far. She's the one who tells Randy he's being ridiculous. She's the one who worries about the kids' safety when the rest of the town is oblivious. She's the one who, in You're Getting Old, has the courage to admit that her marriage isn't working. And in the season 15 mid-season finale, when she says to Randy, everything just seems kind of shitty, that's not comedic hyperbole. That's a woman who has spent 15 years watching her husband descend into increasingly absurd behavior and has finally reached the point where she can't pretend it's normal anymore. But here's the tragic thing about Sharon. She sees clearly, but she can't act on what she sees. She separates from Randy in You're Getting Old, and then takes him back in Asperger. She complains about Tegrity Farms for 7 seasons and stays. She knows her son is struggling, and she can't reach him. Sharon is the show's portrait of a woman trapped by the conventions of her own life, by the expectation that she'll stay, that she'll endure, that she'll hold the family together, no matter how much her husband embarrasses them. And the show respects her for it, I think. Sharon is never the butt of the joke. Her complaints are always valid. Her frustrations are always justified. She's the sanest person in South Park. But sanity in South Park doesn't get you anywhere. It just means you can see exactly how insane everything is without having the power to change it. And that's its own kind of psychological torment. There's a parallel between Sharon and Wendy Testaberger that I think is deliberate. Both are women who are smarter and more perceptive than the men in their lives. Both are consistently frustrated on male incompetence and selfishness. Both stay in relationships that don't fully serve them because the alternative, being alone, starting over, giving up on someone they once loved, seems worse. Sharon is what Wendy might become in 20 years if she stays with Stan. And I think the show knows that. And I think it's one of the reasons Wendy keeps breaking up with Stan and going back. She's trying to avoid Sharon's fate. She keeps failing. Let me also spend a moment on Shelley Marsh, Stan's older sister. Shelley is a bully. She beats Stan up regularly. She's aggressive, angry, and cruel. And the show mostly plays this for slapstick comedy. But there's a psychological reading of Shelley that I think is interesting. She's a kid who is completely overshadowed by her father's antics and her brother's adventures. Nobody pays attention to Shelley. Nobody asks about her day or cares about her problem. She's invisible in her own family, and her violence towards Stan isn't random. It's an expression of rage at being ignored. She can't get attention through achievement or personality, so she gets it through force. It's the same pattern we see in Professor Chaos, except Shelley doesn't even get a costume and a nemesis. She's just angry all the time, and nobody asks why. In the post-COVID specials, we learn that adult Shelley is dead. Randy locked her in a barn because she wouldn't do her weed chores, and she died when Stan burned down Tegrity Farm. And nobody mourns her. Not really, because even in death, Shelley is invisible. The show has been telling us for decades that this family is dysfunctional, and Shelley's fate is the ultimate proof. She was neglected, ignored, and eventually killed by the consequences of her father's obsession. And the story barely pauses to acknowledge it. That's not comedy. That's tragedy wearing comedy's clothes. I want to mention one more dynamic that I think is crucial to the show's psychology, and that's the relationship between the kids and the concept of fame. Because South Park has explored what celebrity does to people more consistently and more insightfully than almost any other show on television. Think about the episodes where Cartman achieves some form of public recognition. He starts a Christian rock band in Christian Rock Hard, Season 7, Episode 9, aired October 29th, 2003, and immediately becomes consumed by the attention. He starts a real estate business in later seasons and is obsessed with the status it brings. When he briefly has his own theme park, his joy isn't about the ride. It's about the exclusivity, about being the one person who has what everyone else wants. And then think about Butters and fame. In The Tale of Scrody McBoogerballs, Season 14, Episode 2, aired March 24th, 2010. The boys write a deliberately offensive book and attribute it to Butters to avoid getting in trouble. And Butters becomes famous. He's on TV, he's celebrated, and he loves it because for the first time in his life, people are paying attention to him. They're listening. He mattered. And the fact that the fame is built on a lie doesn't diminish its psychological effect on him. The recognition fills a void that his parents' neglect created. The show is consistently arguing that fame is a psychological distortion field. It warps behavior. It corrupts motive. It makes people do things they would never otherwise do. Randy dresses as Lord. Cartman starts a church. Butters becomes a pimp in Butters' Bottom Bitch. The desire for recognition, for validation, for the feeling that you matter in a world that doesn't care. That desire drives more behavior in South Park than any other single motivator. More than greed, more than ideology, more than love. And I think that's the show's most damning psychological critique of modern life. That we've built a culture where attention is the primary currency, where being seen is more valuable than being good, where the performance of identity matters more than the reality of it. Every character in South Park who chases fame ends up worse off than they started. Every character who finds peace does so by stepping away from the spotlight, not toward it. Butters' best moments happen in private. The beautiful sadness speech, his quiet kindness, his care for his friend. Kenny's heroism as Mysterion only works because nobody knows who he is. The characters who are most psychologically healthy are the ones who don't need the world to validate them. And that might be the final psychological lesson of South Park. Not that the world is cruel or that people are stupid or that hypocrisy is everywhere, but that the desire to be seen, the desperate, consuming, modern need to matter publicly, is the thing that does the most psychological damage. Cartman's every terrible act is, at its root, a demand for attention. Randy's every obsession is a cry for significance. Kyle's every speech is a performance of virtue for an audience. The quietest characters, Kenny behind his parka, Craig behind his deadpan, Butters behind his sincerity, are the ones closest to actual peace. Maybe that's the thing to fall asleep to tonight. Not a lesson about a specific character or a specific episode, but a quiet suggestion that the characters who fare best in South Park, psychologically speaking, are the ones who stopped needing the world to watch them. The ones who found something real, a friendship, a purpose, a feeling, and held on to it without needing anyone else to validate it. That's harder than it sounds. In a world of social media and constant performance and algorithmic attention, being quietly content is almost revolutionary. But Butters manages it most of the time. Kenny manages it under his parka. Craig manages it with tweak. Even Stan, in his rare good moment, manages it. Standing at the bus stop with Kyle, not saying anything profound, just being present with his best friend. Those moments are the heart of South Park. Not the prank, not the controversy, not the shock value, the bus stop. The silence between two friends who don't need to explain themselves to each other. The knowledge that someone is standing next to you in the cold, waiting for the same bus, going to the same place, and that's enough. It has always been enough. All right, I'm going to stop now, for real. I've been talking for what feels like hours. And if you've been here for all of it, if you're still awake, still listening, still with me, then I don't have the words to thank you properly. So I'll just say this. You are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Someone who wants to go deeper. Someone who cares about what stories mean, not just what happens in them. Someone who understands that a show about construction paper kids in a small Colorado town can contain multitude. Thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for subscribing, if you have. And if you haven't, well, you know what to do. That little button really does make a difference. Sleep well. Dream about something that makes you happy. And remember, take the bad with the good. Beautiful sadness, always. Good night. And one truly last thought, because I think it ties everything together. I've spent this entire video talking about the psychology of individual characters, their traumas, their coping mechanisms, their patterns of behavior. But I want to zoom out one final time and talk about the psychology of South Park as a tech, as an object, as a thing that exists in the world and has been watched by millions of people for nearly 3 decades. Because here's the thing that fascinates me most about this show. South Park is therapy, not in the clinical sense, but in the sense that millions of people, me included, return to this show when they need to feel something, when they need to laugh at something painful, when they need to be reminded that the world is absurd and that absurdity, while terrifying, is also kind of hilarious. There's a concept in psychology called paradoxical relaxation. The idea that sometimes confronting something stressful directly rather than avoiding it actually reduces your anxiety about it. South Park does this constantly. It takes the things that stress us out: politics, religion, death, social change, economic uncertainty, the collapse of shared reality, and exaggerates them to the point of absurdity. And somehow, watching 4 construction paper kids navigate those absurdities makes them feel more manageable in our own lives. When I watch South Park deal with depression through Stan, I feel less alone in my own occasional low point. When I watch Kyle wrestle with the gap between who he wants to be and who he actually is, I recognize that struggle in myself. When I watch Butters get knocked down again and again, and somehow keep choosing kindness, I'm inspired to do the same. Not because a cartoon told me to, but because seeing that choice depicted, even in an animated world made of construction paper, reminds me that the choice exists, that it's available to me, that I can make it. And I think that's why people fall asleep to these videos. Not because they're boring, I hope they're not boring, but because there's something comforting about having someone talk through the things that matter, slowly and carefully, in the dark. About having someone say, here's what this character is going through, and here's why it makes sense, and here's what it tells us about being human. There's something almost meditative about it. And in a world that moves as fast as ours does, a world that demands your attention every second of every day, there's value in slowing down and sitting with something, really sitting with it. The way we've been sitting with these characters tonight. South Park is 28 seasons of sitting with the uncomfortable truth about who we are. It's 28 seasons of looking at the worst parts of human nature and finding, buried underneath the horror, something that might be worth saving. Not much, not always, but something. A friendship, a sacrifice, a speech about beautiful sadness, delivered by a kid in a rain-soaked alley who refuses to stop loving life, even though life has given him every reason to give up. I think that's worth 28 seasons. I think that's worth 300 episodes and special. I think that's worth tonight and this video and however long you've been listening. And I think that's worth one more good night. So here it is, the last one. I promise, cross my heart. Thank you for everything, for being here, for caring about this stuff, for staying awake, or for falling asleep right when you needed to. Either way, you made this video matter, and that's enough. Good night. Take care of each other. And remember, the beautiful sadness is proof that you're alive. See you in the next one. Actually, you know what? One more thing. I just want to say something directly to the people watching this at 2 or 3 in the morning. The ones who put these videos on because the silence is too loud and sleep won't come. I see you. I know what that's like. And I want you to know that this video was made for you, specifically. Not the daytime viewers, not the people who watch at double speed on their commute. You. The person lying in the dark right now, listening to me ramble about cartoon characters, trying to quiet your brain enough to drift off. This show, this ridiculous, profane, brilliant, tender, infuriating show has been there for me on nights like that. Nights where everything felt too big and too heavy and too much. And putting on an episode of South Park or a video like this and just letting the words wash over me, it helped. It didn't fix anything. It didn't make the problems go away, but it made the silence less empty. It made the dark less dark. And sometimes that's all you need. Not a solution, just a voice. Just someone talking to you in the night about something that doesn't matter and matters enormously at the same time. That's what South Park is, in the end. A voice in the dark. A friend who shows up at the bus stop every morning regardless of what happened yesterday. A reminder that the world is insane and you're not alone in noticing. You're not alone in noticing. Good night for the very last time. I love making these for you, and I'll see you in the next one.